In Lockridge Federal Penitentiary, a black inmate was about to make waves after a racist white guard pushed too far. What started as a simple request for more library time spiraled when Sergeant Ray Kincaid, a veteran officer known for his cruel discipline, falsely accused the inmate of orchestrating a gang hit. Malik Ramsey wasn't your typical inmate. Once a respected high school teacher, now serving 12 years for a deadly encounter during a wrongful arrest, he had endured 7 years inside Lockridge with sharp intellect and unshakable dignity. He built a quiet empire behind bars, literacy, programs, legal aid, and respect that transcended gang lines. When Kincaid threw Malik into solitary confinement on trumped-up charges, he had no idea he was messing with a man trained to resist oppression through strategy, not violence. Malik's silent protest lit a fuse, coordinated inmate slowdowns, nonviolent resistance, and a growing unity that disrupted the prison's daily operations. What began as one man's abuse of power would become a reckoning the system couldn't ignore. The prison would never forget the day Sergeant Kincaid met his match and lost control of Lockridge for good. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Heat rose in visible waves from the cracked concrete of Lockridge, Federal Penitentiary's main yard. August in Mississippi wasn't just hot, it was a pressure cooker, especially inside these walls where even the air felt incarcerated. Sergeant Ray Kincaid preferred it this way. Heat made men docile, made them think twice before acting out, made his job easier. Kincaid moved along the second-tier catwalk, boots striking a deliberate rhythm that announced his presence long before he came into view. 22 years on the job had taught him that sound was as effective as sight in maintaining control. A correctional officer didn't just watch, he was watched. The performance was half the power. "Wilson," he called down to a young black inmate mopping the dayroom floor. "You missed a spot." He didn't point, didn't need to. Wilson's shoulders tensed, then slumped in resignation as he dragged the mop back across a perfectly clean section of floor. Kincaid suppressed a smile. These small moments, these tiny exercises of will, were what fed him. Not the violence, though that had its place. It was the breaking down of a man's sense of self through 1,000 paper cuts that Kincaid had perfected. A craft passed down from his father, also a guard who'd taught him that discipline wasn't just about following rules. It was about knowing who made them. "Sergeant Kincaid?" A voice called from behind. Officer Travis Henson, fresh-faced and 3 weeks into the job, approached with a clipboard. Iraq veteran with a chest full of medals and eyes still adjusting to civilian shadows. "The new schedules came down from administration. Warden wants them posted by afternoon count." "Put 'em on my desk, Henson. I'll get to it when I get to it." Kincaid studied the younger man. Henson had potential. Followed orders, kept his mouth shut, didn't flinch during cell extractions. But there was something in his eyes Kincaid didn't trust. A hesitation. A questioning. The system didn't reward questions. "Actually," Kincaid decided, "you handle it. Post him in all blocks. Consider it training." "Yes, sir." Henson nodded, but lingered. "Also, there's an issue in the library. Ramsey is requesting additional time for his literacy program. Says he needs another hour on Tuesdays." Kincaid's jaw tightened at the mention of Malik Ramsey. Teach, they called him. Former high school teacher doing 12 years for manslaughter after he'd fought back during what he claimed was a wrongful arrest. The confrontation had left an officer dead. Ramsey maintained it was self-defense, but to Kincaid, a dead cop was a dead cop. "Tell Ramsey his program runs when I say it runs." Kincaid leaned against the railing. "And remind him that privileges exist at my discretion." Henson made a note. He mentioned that the waiting list has doubled and, "Did I ask for commentary, Officer Henson?" "No, sir." "Then deliver my message. Word for word." As Henson walked away, Kincaid watched the day room below. Like a chessboard, he thought. And every man a piece to be moved or sacrificed. Near the TV area, he spotted Darnell Bricks Wallace, A mountain of a man with hands that could crush cinder blocks, hence the nickname. Serving life for armed robbery gone wrong, fiercely loyal to Ramsey, who'd taken the younger man under his wing years ago. Not far from Brick sat Andre Preach Fields, head bowed over a well-worn Bible. Former pastor convicted on what many considered questionable federal charges, the spiritual authority in the black population, always quoting scripture and counseling patients. Another of Ramsey's inner circle. They were all connected, a network of influence that ran beneath the surface of Lockridge's official power structure. Ramsey was the hub, the quiet strategist who'd built a community around education and dignity rather than violence and contraband. In another life, Kincaid might have respected that. In this one, he saw only threat. The library was Malik Ramsey's domain, a sanctuary of worn paperbacks and outdated encyclopedias that nonetheless represented freedom of a kind. Here, surrounded by words, he could almost forget the walls. Almost. Mr. Henderson needs help with his appeal, Malik said to the young inmate shelving books beside him. Get him the habeas corpus template and the updated statutes on mandatory minimums. You think he's got a shot, Teach? Malik considered this. The law gives and the law takes away. But a man who can articulate his case has one weapon they can't confiscate. The PA system crackled. Attention. Yard recall. All inmates return to housing units immediately. Yard recall. Malik frowned. Yard time wasn't scheduled to end for another 40 minutes. Something had happened. Let's wrap it up, he told his assistant. Looks like we're closing early. As they secured the library, Officer Lisa Medina appeared in the doorway, her usual composed expression tight with concern. Ramsey, you need to head back now, she said, voice low. There was an incident in the yard. Stabbing. Who? Rodriguez. He's alive, but it's bad. They've locked down the yard and called in the tactical team. Malik nodded gravely. Rodriguez was a known enforcer for the Latin Kings, a major player in Lockridge's delicate balance of power. A hit on someone at his level wouldn't go unanswered. I appreciate the heads up, Officer Medina. She hesitated. Kincaid's on the warpath. Be careful. Malik returned to his cell just as the lockdown alarms blared through D block. From his window, he could see officers in riot gear converging on the yard. The whispers traveled fast through the air vents and under doors. Rodriguez had been shanked 3 times in the kidney while spotting another inmate at the weight pile. No one saw who did it. Or no one was talking. Hours later, when the lockdown lifted for dinner, the dining hall hummed with tension. Malik took his usual place between Bricks and Preach, the 3 men forming a buffer against the chaos brewing around them. They're saying it was Aryan Brotherhood, Bricks muttered, massive forearms resting on the table. Payback for that gambling debt last month. Preach shook his head. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, but men rarely listen. This isn't about scripture, Preach, Bricks countered. This is about what comes next. AB hits Kings, Kings hit back harder, and who gets caught in the crossfire? Us. Always us. Malik ate methodically, observing the room. The racial divisions were stark. White inmates clustered defensively, Latin Kings surrounding their tables like fortresses. The guards watched from the perimeter, hands on their batons, some looking almost hopeful for an excuse to use them. We stay neutral, Malik said finally. We focus on our programs, our appeals, our dignity. That's the path. Dignity won't stop a shank, Bricks grumbled. Neither will more violence, Malik replied. Think chess, not checkers. As the words left his mouth, he noticed Sergeant Kincaid enter the dining hall, followed by Officer James Red Atwood, a guard known for his explosive temper and rumored ties to white supremacist groups outside the prison. The 2 men surveyed the room before Kincaid's gaze locked onto Malik's table. A cold certainty settled in Malik's stomach. Something was coming. In Warden Elaine Mercer's office, the air conditioning was cranked to a frigid 65 degrees. She preferred it cold. Kept people on edge, made meetings shorter. Efficiency was her brand. You're telling me? She addressed Kincaid, who stood before her desk. That Ramsey orchestrated the Rodriguez hit? Our model inmate librarian? Yes, ma'am. Kincaid placed a small evidence bag on her desk containing scraps of paper. These notes were intercepted by Officer Atwood during routine cell checks. Coded language, but clear enough when you know what to look for. Ramsey's been building influence, especially with the younger black inmates. This was a power move. Destabilize the kings, create a vacuum. Mercer examined the notes. Even to her untrained eye, they seemed vague, hardly smoking guns. But she'd learned long ago that in prison administration, perception often outweighed truth. The facility was 6 months from its federal review, and her promotion to regional director depended on maintaining the image of a well-run institution. What about physical evidence? The weapon? Not yet recovered, Kincaid admitted. But Rodriguez isn't talking, which tells me he knows who ordered the hit and fears retaliation more than he wants justice. Mercer drummed her fingers on the desk. The last thing we need is a gang war, Sergeant. The Bureau of Prisons is already breathing down my neck about our racial incident metrics. Which is exactly why we need to act decisively, Kincaid pressed. Isolate Ramsey now. Show everyone. There are consequences regardless of who you are. It sends a message. Mercer studied Kincaid. His reputation for maintaining order was why she'd kept him in his position despite occasional complaints from inmates and even staff. Results mattered, more than methods in her book. What about the new CO, Henson? He works the library detail. Has he noticed anything? Henson's still learning the ropes, Kincaid dismissed. He doesn't have the experience to recognize the undercurrents. All right, Mercer decided. Put Ramsey in the SHU pending investigation. 30 days. But Kincaid, make sure this doesn't escalate. I won't have Lockridge becoming another statistic in the BOP's racial incident report. Understood, Warden. Kincaid nodded, satisfaction flickering across his features. I'll handle it personally. The extraction came at 3 a.m. when resistance was least likely and witnesses were few. Malik woke to the sound of his cell door sliding open and the beam of flashlights in his face. Inmate Ramsey, on your feet, hands where we can see them. Kincaid's voice almost pleasant. Malik complied, years of institutional survival kicking in. He knew this dance. Beside Kincaid stood Atwood and 2 other officers in extraction gear. What's this about? Malik asked, keeping his voice level. Administrative segregation pending investigation into your role in the Rodriguez assault, Kincaid replied. Cuff up. Malik turned, placed his hands behind his back. The cuffs bit into his wrists, tighter than necessary, a small cruelty Kincaid never missed an opportunity to inflict. I had nothing to do with Rodriguez, Malik said as they let him out. Save it for your disciplinary hearing, Atwood sneered. If you get one. As they escorted him through the darkened cell block, Malik caught glimpses of faces in the narrow cell windows, silent witnesses to what was happening. He kept his head high, his pace measured. Dignity was sometimes the only possession a man in chains could claim. At the entrance to the special housing unit, solitary by its more honest name, Officer Travis Henson stood for processing, unable to meet Malik's eyes. Ramsey, Malik. Administrative segregation, Kincaid announced. Pending investigation into organizing assault, potential gang activity. Henson began the intake form. Any medical issues we should be aware of? Just a conscience, Malik replied quietly. But that's in remission around here. Kincaid's hand clamped down on Malik's shoulder. Enjoy the quiet time, Teach. Plenty of opportunity to reflect on your choices. As the solid steel door of the isolation cell closed behind him, Malik stood in the center of the bare concrete box. 6 by 9 feet of space. A steel toilet sink combo. A concrete slab with a thin mattress. No books. No window. Just artificial light that never fully dimmed and the distant sounds of men in similar boxes, some talking to themselves, others crying out in the dark. Malik sat on the edge of the bed, closed his eyes, and began to center himself. They could isolate his body, but his mind remained his own. And in the quiet darkness of the SHU, he began to formulate a response. Not with fists or shanks, but with the strategic patience that had kept him alive for 7 years inside Lockridge's walls. By morning, word of Malik's removal had spread through the prison like wildfire. In the dining hall, the atmosphere was electric with suppressed rage and fear. Brick slammed his tray down at the usual table, his face a thundercloud. This is bullshit. Teach had nothing to do with Rodriguez. Everyone knows it was AB business. Preach placed a calming hand on the younger man's arm. Lower your voice, brother. Anger clouds judgment. Judgment? What good is judgment when they can just blackbag one of us in the middle of the night? This calls for action, not more of your turn the other cheek nonsense. From nearby tables, other inmates watched the exchange closely. Malik's influence extended well beyond his immediate circle. His literacy programs, legal aid workshops, and conflict mediation had helped dozens of men navigate the treacherous waters of incarceration. His absence left a vacuum that could quickly fill with chaos. We do this Malik's way, Preach insisted, with intelligence, not impulse. And what way is that? Bricks demanded. Preach leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. We wait, we watch, and we remember that not all warfare requires weapons. At the officer's station, Travis Henson observed the exchange, noting the ripples of conversation spreading outward from Malik's known associates. Something about the entire situation felt wrong. The evidence Kincaid had shown him, fragments of notes with vague references that could mean anything, seemed flimsy at best, fabricated at worst. Enjoying the view, rookie? Sergeant Kincaid appeared beside him. Good lesson here. See how they're clustering, plotting? This is why we stay on top of them. One moment of weakness and the whole system crashes down. Henson nodded non-committally. The notes you found, you're sure they connect to Rodriguez? Kincaid's expression hardened. You questioning my assessment, Officer Henson? No, sir. Just trying to understand the process. Process is simple. Inmates like Ramsey think they're smarter than us, think they can run their operations behind a veil of respectability. Our job is to remind them who's really in control. Kincaid's radio crackled with a call from another block. Handle the rest of count. And Henson, be careful about sympathizing with inmates. Fastest way to compromise your effectiveness as an officer. As Kincaid walked away, Henson's gaze returned to the dining hall, where the tension was almost a visible current in the air. In 3 weeks at Lockridge, he'd heard countless stories about Malik Teach Ramsey, from officers who considered him a manipulative troublemaker to inmates who spoke of him with near reverence. The truth, Henson suspected, lay somewhere in between. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Sergeant Ray Kincaid wasn't interested in truth. He was interested in control. And in Lockridge Federal Penitentiary, those were rarely the same thing. In the silent darkness of his isolation cell, Malik Ramsey rested his forehead against the cool concrete wall. 30 years old, with 7 years down and 5 to go. If his appeal never went through. If he played by their rules. If he accepted the fundamental lie that justice applied equally to all men. Outside these walls, he'd taught high school history to kids everyone else had given up on. He'd shown them that the past wasn't just a collection of dead facts, but a living guide to understanding power. How it worked, how it corrupted, and occasionally, how it could be challenged. Now, in the enforced solitude of the SHU, Malik applied those same analytical skills to his current situation. Kincaid had been gunning for him for years, threatened by any black man who commanded respect without resorting to violence. The Rodriguez stabbing was merely a convenient pretext. But pretexts could be turned against their creators. Power that relied on fear and division was inherently unstable. It required constant maintenance, constant displays of force. Malik's breath fogged the wall as he whispered into the concrete, a message to no one and everyone. Dignity before freedom. The mantra had become his North Star inside Lockridge. Now it would become his weapon. He settled onto his bunk, closed his eyes, and began planning a resistance that would shake Lockridge's foundations. Not with riots or bloodshed, but with something far more threatening to men like Kincaid: unified defiance from those deemed powerless. The quiet order was about to be disturbed not by chaos, but by its opposite: disciplined, strategic silence. Time dissolved in the SHU. Without windows or clocks, the human mind created its own markers: meals, guard shifts, the distant sounds of doors opening and closing somewhere in the endless corridor of isolation cells. On what Malik estimated was his 4th day, the fluorescent lights flickered. For a moment he thought it was another power surge, common in Mississippi summers when the ancient prison electrical grid strained under the weight of air conditioners running in staff areas. But the lights didn't just dim, they pulsed in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Or was his heartbeat matching them? Malik pressed his palms against his eyes, willing the hallucination away. Sensory deprivation did strange things to the mind. He'd seen it before. Men who went into the hole intact and emerged fractured, speaking to people who weren't there. "Not me," he whispered. "Not today." He began reciting passages from books he'd memorized. The autobiography of Malcolm X, The Fire Next Time, the Constitution with all its amendments. Words anchored him to reality when reality itself became fluid. The slot in his door slid open with a metallic scrape. "Enjoying the accommodations, Teach?" Sergeant Kincaid's voice. "Not quite the library, is it?" Malik didn't respond. Engagement was what Kincaid wanted, a reaction, preferably anger or desperation, that would justify further restrictions. "Silent treatment?" Kincaid chuckled. "That's fine. We've got all the time in the world. 30 days is just the beginning. With your record, I could make a case for extended administrative segregation. 6 months. A year, maybe." Still, Malik said nothing, staring at the blank wall opposite his bed. "Rodriguez is recovering, by the way. Still not talking about who stuck him, but we're working on that. Matter of time before someone flips on you." The slot slammed shut. Malik exhaled slowly. Kincaid's visit wasn't random. The sergeant was fishing, hoping isolation had softened Malik enough to provoke a denial, a plea, any response that acknowledged Kincaid's power in this equation. Instead of dwelling on Kincaid's taunts, Malik turned his focus inward, to a plan that had been forming since his first night in the SHU. If he couldn't communicate with the general population directly, he would have to trust that the foundation he'd built over years would hold, that Preach, Bricks, and others would understand what needed to be done. Dignity before freedom. The phrase wasn't just a personal mantra, it was a philosophy he'd shared in the prison library, in the yard, in quiet conversations during meals. It meant that while they couldn't control their circumstances, they could control their responses. Now it was time to see if that lesson had taken root. Officer Travis Henson noticed the change during morning count in D Block. Usually inmates responded to their names with "here" or "present." Today, silence. Each man stood at his cell door when his name was called, but no voice acknowledgement came. "Henderson," Henson called out. The older inmate simply nodded. "Verbal." "Confirmation, Henderson," Henson instructed, following protocol. Henderson stared straight ahead, expressionless. Down the line it went. Name after name met with rigid silence. By the time Henson finished count, an uneasy feeling had settled in his stomach. He'd been warned about collective actions during training, hunger strikes, work stoppages, the preludes to riots, but this silent coordination was something different. More disciplined, more unnerving. In the officer's station, Henson reported the anomaly to the shift supervisor. D Block inmates are refusing verbal response during count. "Write 'em up," the supervisor shrugged. "Every single one. That'll change their tune by tomorrow." But the next day brought more silence, extending beyond count. In the dining hall, inmates took their meals without a word. In the yard, they exercised in eerie quiet. Work details slowed to a crawl as inmates performed their tasks with deliberate, almost exaggerated care, taking 3 times longer than normal to mop a floor or sort laundry. By the 3rd day, the silence had spread through every block housing black inmates. The prison's routines, which relied on a certain level of compliance and communication, began to falter. In the laundry facility, Darnell Bricks Wallace stood, at his station, meticulously folding each uniform with practiced precision. Officer Atwood circled him like a predator. "You think this little protest is going to change anything, Wallace?" Atwood taunted. "Thought you were smarter than that." Bricks continued folding, his massive hands moving with surprising delicacy over the coarse fabric. "Hey!" Atwood slammed his palm on the folding table. "I'm talking to you, inmate." Bricks looked up slowly, his expression neutral. Then, with deliberate care, he lifted a freshly folded uniform and placed it on the growing stack. Atwood's face flushed. "That's it. Disciplinary write-up for refusing direct orders." As Atwood scribbled furiously on his citation pad, Preach entered with a cart of dirty linens. He caught Bricks's eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Bricks exhaled slowly, tension visibly leaving his shoulders as he returned to his folding. Later, in the relative privacy of the tool shed where they both had work assignment, Preach spoke quietly. "Brother, you need to cool that fire. This isn't about standing up to every guard who pokes at you." "Then what is it about?" Bricks demanded, keeping his voice low. "It's been 5 days, Preach. 5 days of this silent treatment, and what's changed? Teach is still in the hole." "It's not about immediate results," Preach explained. "It's about demonstrating that we can act as one, that we can maintain discipline even under pressure." He smiled slightly. "You think Teach would want you catching extra time just to spite?" "Atwood?" Bricks grunted. I know. Chess, not checkers." "Exactly. And right now we're setting up the board." Warden Elaine Mercer's office was a climate-controlled oasis in Lockridge's oppressive heat. Today, however, even the aggressive air conditioning couldn't cut through the tension as she reviewed the incident reports piling up on her desk. 37 work slowdowns in 3 days, she read aloud to Kincaid, who stood at attention before her. 19 cases of inmates refusing verbal response to staff. 12 incidents of refused meals. She dropped the folder. "Care to explain this, Sergeant?" Kincaid shifted his weight slightly. "It's a coordinated response to Ramsey's segregation, a show of solidarity." "A show that's disrupting my facility," Mercer snapped. "The monthly efficiency reports are due to the regional office next week. How do you suggest I explain this dramatic decline in productivity?" "It's temporary," Kincaid assured her. "They'll break when they realize it won't change anything. Inmates always do." Mercer leaned back in her chair, studying Kincaid with cold calculation. "Tell me honestly, Sergeant, was Ramsey actually behind the Rodriguez stabbing?" A flicker of something, doubt, defensiveness, crossed Kincaid's face before his professional mask slipped back into place. The evidence suggested his involvement, whether direct or indirect. "That's not what I asked," Mercer interrupted. "I asked if he did it, because right now, I've got a prison operating at 50% efficiency over a man in segregation, and I need to know if this disruption is based on solid ground or if we've created a martyr over nothing." Kincaid straightened. "Ramsey has been building influence beyond appropriate boundaries for years. The stabbing may have been a convenient trigger, but isolating him was necessary regardless. He represents a threat to institutional control." Mercer's expression hardened. "Fix this, Sergeant, I don't care how. Increased privileges for compliance, extra restrictions for resistance, whatever tool works. But get my prison back under control." After Kincaid left, Mercer opened her computer and began composing an email to the regional director, carefully framing Lockridge's current situation as a proactive security measure in response to escalating gang tensions, rather than the slow-motion rebellion it was becoming. The medical unit was the one place in Lockridge where white walls replaced the institutional gray and beige that dominated the rest of the facility. Officer Lisa Medina had requested the medical unit assignment when she'd transferred to Lockridge. 3 years ago, a small reminder of her previous career as a nurse before economic necessity had pushed her into corrections. Today, she wheeled a medication cart down the silent corridor of the SHU, stopping at Malik Ramsey's cell. The protocol was strict, officer present during all medical interactions with segregated inmates. Fortunately, her regular partner for these rounds was Officer Chen, one of the few guards who could be trusted to look the other way when necessary. "Step back from the door, Ramsey," Chen called out as he unlocked the cell. "Medical check." Malik complied, standing against the far wall as Medina entered with her cart. The cell was spotless, not a surprise given how little there was inside it, but still a testament to Malik's determination to maintain standards even in isolation. "BP check and medication review," Medina announced for the official record, then lowered her voice as she approached with the blood pressure cuff. "They've started it." The silence. It's spreading through every block. Malik's expression remained neutral, but his eyes registered understanding. "Kincaid's furious," she continued, wrapping the cuff around his arm and speaking under the sound of the Velcro. "Cell raids in D block yesterday. Looking for contraband, communication, anything to break it up." As she pressed the stethoscope to the inside of his elbow, Malik finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "Tell Preach, 3 phases. Phase 1 is silence. Phase 2 is statistics." Medina's brow furrowed slightly in confusion, but she nodded as she removed the cuff. "Blood pressure normal," she said at regular volume. "Anything else needed here?" Chen called from the doorway, sounding bored. "Just checking his previous complaint about headaches," Medina replied, taking out a small penlight. As she leaned in to check Malik's pupils, he spoke again. "They track everything: attendance, productivity, incidents. If numbers change, questions get asked, up the chain." Medina understood immediately. The prison system was built on documentation. Every aspect of institutional life recorded, quantified, reported to state and federal overseers. Disrupt those numbers, and attention would follow. "Got it," she whispered. Then aloud, "Pupils normal, no sign of neurological issues. I'll note the headache complaint in your file." As she packed up her cart, she saw the toll 7 days in the SHU had taken on Malik, the slight gauntness to his face, the shadows under his eyes. But there was something else there too, a clarity of purpose and undiminished focus that impressed and slightly unnerved her. Once back in the medical unit, Medina updated Malik's chart, adding a note about his continuing headaches to justify another check-in a few days later. Then, during her lunch break, she made her way to the chapel where Preach was known to spend his free time. "Medical delivery," she said quietly as she passed him a small bottle of vitamins, an authorized exchange that wouldn't raise eyebrows. Inside the bottle, wrapped around the pills, was a slip of paper with Malik's message. Preach nodded almost imperceptibly, pocketing the bottle without comment. The darkness in the SHU was absolute when the lights went out at 11 p.m., a smothering physical presence that pressed against the skin. Malik had learned to use these hours for mental exercise, constructing elaborate memory palaces where he stored quotes, statistics, legal precedents, anything that might serve him once he returned to general population. Tonight he focused on time. Without external markers, minutes stretched into hours, and isolation could quickly erode a man's sense of self. He counted his breaths, 7,200 in 2 hours, a meditation technique that doubled as a makeshift clock. A noise outside his cell interrupted his count. Footsteps, then the sound of something sliding across the floor beneath his door. A shadow moved past the narrow strip of light that outlined the cell entrance. Malik waited until the footsteps receded before moving carefully toward the door. His fingers found a small object, hard plastic, rectangular. A digital watch, the kind sold in commissary. Against regulations in the SHU, but a lifeline to someone losing track of time. He pressed the light button, 1:17 a.m. The gesture was clear. Someone on the night shift was sympathetic to his situation. Officer Henson, perhaps? The young CO had seemed troubled by Malik's segregation. Malik returned to his bunk, clutching the small device like a talisman. In his mind, he began mapping the possibilities this small act of rebellion represented, not just for tracking time, but for what it suggested about cracks in the system's facade. Travis Henson sat in his small apartment 20 miles from Lockridge, staring at a blank page in a composition notebook. He'd started journaling after his second tour in Iraq, a suggestion from the VA counselor who'd helped him through the worst of his PTSD. Getting thoughts on paper made them less likely to circle endlessly in his head. Tonight, his entry began, hesitantly. Day 31 at Lockridge. Something's happening that they didn't cover in training. The inmates have organized some kind of silent protest. No direct disobedience, just this eerie silence and slowdown that's grinding everything to a halt. It's over Ramsey being put in segregation, a man I've barely spoken to, but whose name carries weight with half the prison population. Today, Kincaid ordered cell raids in C and D blocks. Nothing significant found, but I watched him plant a sharpened toothbrush under Johnson's mattress. When I asked about it later, he told me, "Sometimes you need to make an example to maintain order." Is this what maintaining order looks like? Creating evidence to punish men who haven't broken any rules, just because their silent dignity is more threatening than outright defiance? I enlisted because I believed in protecting a system worth defending. I took this job for the same reason. But what am I actually protecting here? Henson closed the notebook and tucked it into his desk drawer. The questions kept coming, but answers remained elusive. One thing was becoming clear, though. Sergeant Ray Kincaid wasn't the mentor he'd initially taken him for, and Lockridge wasn't the orderly institution it presented itself to be. Both were facades concealing something much darker. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the 10th day of Malik's segregation, Lockridge Federal Penitentiary was operating under a strange new rhythm. The silence had evolved into a precise choreography of minimal compliance. Inmates performed required tasks with technical adherence to rules, but nothing more. No voluntary participation in optional programs, no helpful suggestions to staff, no informal cooperation that had once oiled the machinery of daily operations. In the administration building, reports piled up, production quotas in prison industries missed by 40%. Commissary sales down by a third. Attendance at voluntary programming, educational classes, religious services, counseling, dropped to record lows. Numbers that would trigger questions from regional oversight. Kincaid's frustration manifested in escalating countermeasures. Recreation time cut. Cell raids increased, stricter enforcement of minor infractions. But each tightening of control seemed to strengthen the inmates' resolve rather than break it. In the yard, under the blistering Mississippi sun, bricks and EUM, a group of younger inmates maintained their exercise routine in disciplined silence. When Officer Atwood deliberately knocked over their water cooler, not a single man reacted. They simply continued their push-ups, their faces betraying no emotion as sweat pooled beneath them on the hot concrete. Nearby, Preach sat with his Bible. Study group, a circle of men who now read in silence, occasionally pointing to passages to share without speaking. When the signal for yard recall came 15 minutes early, they closed their books and lined up without complaint or question. The quiet power of their collective restraint was more unsettling to the guards than any outburst could have been. It suggested a level of organization and discipline that undermined the fundamental premise of incarceration, that these men were impulsive, dangerous, incapable of self-governance. As the inmates filed back toward their housing units, Sergeant Kincaid watched from the observation post, jaw clenched in barely contained rage. For the first time in his 22 years of correctional work, he felt the solid ground of control shifting beneath his feet. The quiet order he'd so carefully maintained through calculated cruelty and manipulation was being replaced by something he couldn't intimidate or break: silence with purpose. And in that silence, power was changing hands. Until further notice, all non-essential privileges are suspended. The announcement came over the PA system during breakfast on day 14 of what the guards had started calling the silence. Sergeant Kincaid's voice, amplified and distorted, echoed through the dining hall. Recreational yard time will be reduced to 30 minutes daily. Shower access limited to 3 times weekly. Commissary restrictions in effect. Phone privileges suspended except for verified legal calls. A muscle twitched in Brix's jaw as he stared down at his tray. Beside him, Preach closed his eyes briefly, as if in prayer. Additionally, Kincaid continued, until normal operations resume, all housing units will undergo enhanced inspections. Contraband will result in immediate disciplinary action. As the announcement ended, CO Atwood stalked between the tables, his face flushed with anticipation. Hear that, ladies? Daddy's laying down new rules. He stopped behind a younger inmate, named Dexter Williams, leaning down to speak directly into his ear. Maybe now you'll find your voices again. Williams, 23 years old, first federal bid, 3 years into a 7-year sentence for a nonviolent drug offense, stared straight ahead, but his hands trembled slightly. Preach noticed. After meal dismiss, he caught up with Williams in the corridor. Stay strong, young blood, he said quietly, breaking the silence for a strategic moment. This is when it matters most. Williams nodded, but his eyes were distant. I haven't heard from my girl in 2 weeks. Now they're cutting phone calls when my son's birthday is coming up. I know it's hard, Preach acknowledged, but remember what Teach always says. They expect us to break, to fight back in ways that justify their cruelty. Our power is in refusing to be what they say we are. Yeah, Williams muttered. Power. Right. As Williams walked away, Preach felt a growing unease. The pressure was mounting, and not everyone had the spiritual or mental fortitude to endure what was coming, particularly the younger men, those without the perspective that time and suffering provided. In that moment, Preach made a decision. It was time to speak with the others, to reinforce the foundation before cracks became fissures. In the staff locker room, Officer Travis Henson changed into his uniform with mechanical precision. The dark circles under his eyes betrayed another night of restless sleep, his mind replaying the events of the previous day's enhanced inspection of D Block. 3 hours of inmates standing facing the wall while their cells were torn apart. Personal, photos ripped from letters, religious texts thrown to the floor, mattresses slashed open in search of contraband. And through it all, Kincaid's voice. They want to play games? We can play games too. You look like hell, remarked Officer Chen, closing his locker. Henson forced a smile. Late night, still adjusting to the schedule. Get used to it, word. Is we're moving to mandatory overtime until this silent treatment crap ends. Another voice joined the conversation. Should have crushed this on day 1. Officer Atwood, red-faced as usual, slammed his locker shut. Putting Ramsey and Seg wasn't enough. Should have thrown every one of his followers in there with him. We don't have enough segregation cells, Chen pointed out. Don't need 'em, Atwood countered. Just the ringleaders. A few well-chosen examples. That's how Kincaid used to handle things before all this sensitivity training bullshit. Henson frowned. Isn't the point to maintain order without excessive force? Atwood's eyes narrowed. The point, rookie, is to maintain order. Period. Whatever it takes. He stepped closer to Henson. You been here what? 6 weeks? Maybe check that bleeding heart at the gate before you start questioning methods that work. After Atwood left, Chen shook his head. Word of advice, don't challenge Atwood or Kincaid on how they handle inmates. Not if you want to last here. Is that what we're doing? Lasting? Henson asked quietly. Chen gave him a strange look. That's the job. You punch in, you survive your shift, you punch out. Leave the philosophy for college kids. But as Henson headed to his post, the question lingered. Was survival all this job offered? Was that enough? Malik's hair had begun to grow out during his time in the SHU. No longer the clean-cut fade he'd maintained in general population. He ran his hand over the short curls, feeling the texture change as his body adapted to this new normal. Standing count, called a voice as his cell door slot opened. Officer Medina's eyes appeared in the narrow opening, checking that he was alive and present. All good, Ramsey? She asked, the routine question carrying hidden meaning. Fine, Malik replied simply, their coded exchange now familiar. A one-word answer meant he needed to speak with her. Silence meant all was well. Medical check-in later today, she informed him before moving to the next cell. Hours later, as the blood pressure cuff tightened around his arm, Malik spoke in low tones. "They're increasing the pressure. How are people holding up?" Medina kept her expression neutral. "Fractures beginning. 2 fights yesterday after shower restrictions were announced. Williams is struggling, Preach is worried." Malik nodded slightly. "I need paper, as much as you can safely bring, and the carbon sheets from requisition forms." Medina's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't question the request. "I'll see what I can do. Anything else?" "Preach needs to gather the elders. Remind them this is phase 2. The more they squeeze, the more evidence we collect." "And what about the younger guys? Williams isn't the only one close to breaking." Malik's expression softened briefly. "Tell them I see them, that I haven't forgotten, that sometimes the greatest power comes from enduring what seems unbearable." After Medina left, Malik sat cross-legged on his bunk, eyes closed. The watch hidden beneath his mattress read 2:47 p.m., 2 weeks and 3 days in segregation. The isolation was supposed to break him, to disconnect him from the movement he'd inspired. Instead, it had crystallized his resolve and clarified his strategy. When Medina returned during night med rounds, she slipped several sheets of paper and 2 carbon sheets under his dinner tray. That night, under the dim glow of his cell light, Malik began writing. Careful, precise documentation of every policy violation, every constitutionally questionable restriction, every incident of disparate treatment based on race. He cited case, law, BOP regulations, federal statutes. The teacher had become the tactician, weaponizing the system's own rules against it. Between the original and the carbon copy, a record was being created, one that would remain inside the walls, and one that would find its way outside. In the quiet sanctuary of the prison chapel, a circle of men gathered under the guise of a prayer meeting. Preach at the center, Bricks to his right, 5 other elder inmates completing the ring. "Brothers," Preach began, voice barely above a whisper, "we're at a critical moment. Kincaid is escalating, trying to break our unity. Some of our younger soldiers are wavering. Williams is talking about quitting the silence," one man said. "Says it's not worth losing his phone calls, missing his kid's birthday." Bricks leaned forward. "Man's got a point. We're 2 weeks in, and what have we accomplished? Teach is still in the hole. Guards are cracking down harder. Some of us starting to wonder if this is the right play." "It's exactly what Teach anticipated," Preach countered. "Remember his message, 3 phases. First silence, then statistics, making them create the evidence of their own abuses through overreaction." "And the 3rd phase?" another elder asked. "Exposure," Preach replied. "But we need to hold the line until then, especially for young brothers like Williams." The conversation continued in hushed tones, strategies debated, responsibilities divided. Each man would counsel and support those in their respective cell blocks. Each would document incidents, memorizing details that couldn't be safely written down. Each would stand firm, modeling the disciplined resistance that was becoming their most powerful weapon. None of them noticed Officer Henson standing in the shadowed doorway, listening with a conflicted expression before quietly backing away. Dexter Williams sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the small photos of his son taped to the wall. Jawan's 5th birthday was in 3 days, the call he'd promised to make, now impossible with phone restrictions. Around him, the cell he'd managed to keep relatively clean despite 3 years of incarceration lay in disarray from the morning's inspection. His mattress partially gutted, books thrown to the floor. Even his son's drawings had been removed from the wall, deemed excessive decoration in violation of housing regulations. He picked up one of the photos, Jawan at the zoo, wide smile revealing a missing front tooth, and traced the outline of his son's face with his finger. "Daddy's trying," he whispered, "but I don't know if I'm strong enough for this fight." While other inmates had years or even decades to serve, Williams had been counting down to a release date just 4 years away. A date that could be pushed back by disciplinary infractions. A date that represented his chance to be in his son's life before the boy grew up without him. The sound of the cell block door opening pulled him from his thoughts. Officer Atwood and another guard were making rounds, stopping at each cell for random inspection. "Williams," Atwood called as he approached. "Let's see what you're hiding today." "You just searched the whole block this morning," Williams replied, forgetting the silence protocol in his exhaustion. Atwood smiled. "Well, would you listen to that? Found your voice after all." He unlocked the cell door. "Now I'm really curious what else you've been hiding." As the officers entered his cell, Williams felt something inside him snap. The accumulated weight of restriction, disrespect, and powerlessness crystallized into a moment of desperate clarity. Without a word, he walked to the small steel sink in the corner of his cell, picked up the razor he'd been issued for shaving, and before either officer could react, dragged it across his wrist. "Code Blue, D304, Code Blue." The alarm blared through Lockridge as Williams was rushed to the medical unit, a makeshift tourniquet around his wrist. The wound was dramatic, but not life-threatening, a cry for help rather than a determined attempt. In the aftermath, the silent protest fractured momentarily as inmates broke rank to shout accusations at the guards who'd pushed Williams over the edge. For 2 hours, Lockridge teetered on the brink of riot until Preach and the other elders moved through the blocks, restoring calm through their presence and example. Warden Mercer summoned Kincaid to her office immediately. "An inmate suicide. Attempt broadcast to every news outlet in the state," she said, voice tight with controlled fury as she showed him the press inquiries already flooding her email. "Exactly the kind of incident I told you to prevent." "Williams was unstable before any of this started," Kincaid defended. "His psych evaluation from intake noted depression and anxiety, which makes him exactly the type of inmate you should have been monitoring during increased restrictions." Mercer slammed her hand on the desk. "Do you have any idea what this does to our standing with the Bureau? What it means for my quarterly review?" "With respect, Warden, we're dealing with an organized insurgency. Williams is collateral damage in a necessary crackdown." Mercer's eyes narrowed. "Insurgency? This isn't a war zone, Sergeant. It's a federal facility that I'm responsible for. And your heavy-handed approach is creating more problems than it's solving." "So what do you suggest? We reward their behavior? Reinstate privileges? Bring Ramsey back to general population? I'm suggesting you find smarter ways to break this than turning my prison into a pressure cooker." Mercer straightened the files on her desk, regaining her composure. "The suicide attempt changes things. There will be questions from regional, possibly an investigation." "I can handle any investigation," Kincaid assured her. "See that you do. Because if I go down over this, Sergeant, I'm taking you with me." Officer Lisa Medina sat in her car in the parking lot of a diner 30 miles from Lockridge, heart pounding as she waited. The manila envelope on the passenger seat contained copies of incident reports, medical records, and internal memos, documentation of excessive force incidents involving Kincaid and Atwood stretching back 3 years. Records she had no legal right to remove from the facility. Records that could cost her not just her job but potentially her freedom. A tap on the window made her jump. A woman in her 40s with short gray hair and serious eyes motioned for her to unlock the doors. Elena Cortez, prison reform advocate and regional coordinator for Justice Watch, a civil rights organization that monitored conditions in correctional facilities. "You're taking a massive risk," Elena said as she slid into the passenger seat. "Someone had to," Medina replied, handing over the envelope. "Williams won't be the last if this continues. These reports show a pattern, mostly black inmates, mostly under Kincaid or Atwood's supervision. Injuries documented as resistance during standard procedures or self-harm." Elena opened the envelope, scanning the documents. "This is compelling, but not enough for formal action. We need more. Specific incidents, witness statements, evidence that can't be dismissed as administrative error." "I can get more," Medina said, surprising herself with her certainty. "But I need to know it will make a difference, that someone's actually listening." "We're listening," Elena assured her. "And we have contacts at the Justice Department who will listen too, once we have enough to demand an investigation." She hesitated. "The inmate organizing this, Malik Ramsey. What can you tell me about him?" He's not what they say he is, Medina answered simply. He's teaching them to fight with dignity instead of violence, to use the system's rules against itself. A dangerous man, then, Elena observed. Just not in the way the prison claims. Medina nodded. The most dangerous kind. He's showing them they have power, even in chains. Travis Henson sat in the prison's records room, officially filing incident reports from his shift, but actually searching for something specific. The comment Atwood had made in the locker room had sparked his curiosity. That's how Kincaid used to handle things. Used to. Before something changed. It had taken days of careful observation to learn the filing system, to understand which records were digitized and which still existed only on paper, to figure out which administrator's login was carelessly left active on shared computers. Now, working quickly during the graveyard shift when the administration building was nearly empty, he scrolled through personnel files until he found what he was looking for, a sealed internal review from 7 years ago, involving Sergeant Kincaid and several inmates from the predominantly black cell block he'd supervised. The file was heavily redacted, but certain phrases jumped out. Allegations of systematic harassment, racial epithets documented in multiple witness statements, unauthorized disciplinary measures not recorded in official logs, and most damning, investigation inconclusive due to insufficient evidence and witness retraction. The review had been closed without formal action, but with a recommendation that Sergeant Kincaid be reassigned to a different housing unit and undergo additional training in cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. Recommendations that had clearly been ignored. Henson quickly made screenshots with his phone, a serious violation of policy, but he was beyond caring about rules that protected abusers. As he closed the file and logged out, a voice from the doorway froze him in place. "Working late, Officer Henson?" He turned slowly to find Sergeant Kincaid watching him, eyes cold with suspicion. "Just catching up on reports, Sergeant," Henson replied, sliding his phone into his pocket. "Lot of incidents to document lately." "Indeed." Kincaid stepped into the room. "Challenging times reveal who has what it takes for this job, and who doesn't." "I'm learning that," Henson acknowledged, trying to keep his voice steady. "Learning what exactly?" "That maintaining order is more complicated than it seemed in training." Kincaid's eyes narrowed slightly. "Order isn't complicated, Henson. It's quite simple. Those with authority use it. Those without, submit to it. Complications arise only when people forget their place in that equation." "Yes, sir." "I've noticed you spending time around D-Block, around Ramsey's people, listening to their complaints, showing sympathy." Kincaid moved closer. "Let me give you some advice. This silent treatment, this resistance, it's a test. Not just for them, but for us, for you. Whose side are you on, Henson?" "I wasn't aware we were taking sides, Sergeant. I thought we were all on the side of institutional safety and security." A dangerous smile spread across Kincaid's face. "Don't get philosophical with me, boy. I've been breaking men like you since you were in high school. This job will eat you alive if you go soft. If you start seeing them as people worth listening to." "Is that a threat, Sergeant?" "It's a reality check, one you desperately need." Kincaid gestured toward the door. "Finish your reports elsewhere. Records room is closed for inventory." Henson gathered his paperwork, acutely aware of the phone in his pocket with its damning evidence. As he reached the door, Kincaid called after him. "Remember, Henson, in here you're either with us or against us, no middle ground." The words echoed in Henson's mind as he walked away. A line drawn, a choice demanded. In that moment, Travis Henson knew he'd already chosen his side. The first article appeared in the Clarion Ledger on a Tuesday morning. A small piece buried in the state section headlined, "Inmate Suicide Attempt Raises Questions About Conditions at Federal Prison." By Wednesday, a regional civil rights organization called Justice Watch had issued a press release demanding an independent review of Lockridge's practices, citing credible reports of racially motivated mistreatment and excessive disciplinary measures. On Thursday, 3 state legislators sent a formal letter to the Bureau of Prisons requesting information about Williams's suicide attempt and allegations of restrictive conditions. And on Friday, exactly 3 weeks after Malik Ramsey had been placed in segregation, Warden Elaine Mercer received a phone call from the regional director's office informing her that Lockridge Federal Penitentiary would be subject to review by the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. What had begun as a silent protest within prison walls had found its voice in the outside world. The pressure points had been identified, pressed with strategic precision, and now the system's defensive reflexes were triggered. In his cell in the SAU, Malik received the news from Medina during a medical check. "It's starting," she whispered. "Justice Watch has filed a formal complaint. DOJ is sending preliminary investigators." Malik nodded, allowing himself a small smile. "Phase 3, he whispered back. "Now we need every record, every witness, every detail. They'll try to control the narrative. Our truth needs to be louder." "And what about you?" Medina asked. "You're still in here while this plays out." Malik's expression remained serene, a man who had found purpose in his confinement rather than being diminished by it. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he replied. "Sometimes the most powerful position isn't on the front line. It's behind enemy lines, watching them reveal themselves." As Medina left, Malik returned to the letter he'd been writing, his most comprehensive documentation yet of Lockridge's systemic abuses. His hands, once used to write lesson plans for high school students, now crafted something far more consequential. A roadmap for dismantling an architecture of oppression, piece by carefully documented piece. Warden Elaine Mercer stared at the official Department of Justice letterhead on her desk with tightly controlled fury. The language was bureaucratically bland, but its implications were explosive. Notice of preliminary investigation into allegations of civil rights violations. 3 pages of specific concerns followed, each more damning than the last. Her office door opened without a knock. Kincaid entered, his face a storm cloud. "You've seen the news?" he asked, gesturing to the local paper in her trash bin. The headline read, "Federal Prison Under Scrutiny. Justice Watch Claims Pattern of Abuse." "I've seen more than that," Mercer replied, sliding the DOJ letter across the desk. "This arrived this morning. They're sending a team next week." Kincaid scanned the document, his complexion darkening. "These allegations are straight from Ramsey's playbook. Someone is feeding information outside." "I don't care about your conspiracy theories," Mercer snapped. "I care about containing this before it derails my career." The regional director called. "This morning, the Bureau is concerned about optics." She practically spat the word. "We need to identify the leak. We need to get our statistics in order. The DOJ will want records, incident reports, disciplinary measures, demographic breakdowns. Everything needs to show we're running a clean operation." Kincaid leaned forward. "With respect, Warden, we can't document our way out of this. We need to break this resistance, find the inside source, and eliminate the threat." "And your approach has worked so well so far?" Mercer's voice dripped sarcasm. 3 weeks of escalating restrictions, and all we have to show for it is a suicide attempt, media attention, and now federal oversight. Then give me authorization to transfer the key players, split them up, send them to different facilities, break the network. Mercer considered this. The paperwork would raise questions during an active investigation. Then let me put them all in segregation, administrative, not punitive, for security concerns during the investigation. And hand Justice Watch more ammunition about mass punishment? No. Mercer stood, smoothing her jacket. We're going to take a different approach. De-escalation. Kincaid's expression registered disbelief. You can't be serious. Deadly serious. Starting with Ramsey. He's being transferred from the SHU to transitional housing this afternoon. You're rewarding their behavior. I'm changing the narrative before DOJ arrives. We're going to present a facility that's addressing concerns, not inflaming them. Mercer's eyes narrowed. And you, Sergeant, are going to play along perfectly. Because if I go down for this, I'll make sure you're buried so deep you'll never see daylight. The Transitional Housing Unit was a stark improvement over the SHU, a small pod of 8 cells designed for inmates transitioning back to general population after extended segregation. Still restricted, but with access to a day room, limited programming, and most importantly, interaction with other people. Malik sat on the edge of his new bunk, adjusting to the relative spaciousness after 3 weeks in a concrete box. His mind was clear despite the psychological toll of isolation, perhaps even clearer than before, focused by adversity into diamond-hard resolve. A guard appeared at his cell door. Recreation period. Day room access for 1 hour. In the small common area, 2 other inmates looked up from a chess game. One he didn't recognize, but the other was a familiar face that made his heart leap. Andre Preach Fields watching him with a carefully neutral expression that didn't match the joy in his eyes. Ramsey, Preach acknowledged, keeping his tone casual for the cameras. Care to play winner? Been a while since I've exercised my mind that way, Malik replied, taking a seat nearby. They spoke in coded language, ostensibly about chess, but conveying much more. Preach updated him on the silent protest's evolution, how inmates were now strategically missing medical appointments and religious services, creating statistical anomalies that would trigger oversight flags in the federal systems monitoring algorithms. The power of absence. Malik nodded. Empty spaces speak volumes. Some brothers finding it harder than others, Preach admitted. Williams got released from medical yesterday, on suicide watch now. And Bricks? Maintaining discipline, surprisingly. Becoming a leader in his own right, keeps the younger ones in line. A ghost of a smile crossed Malik's face. Growth under pressure, that's how diamonds form. What about you? Plans now that you're out of the hole? Malik leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper. Phase 3 continues. Documentation becomes evidence. Every incident, every violation. We're building a case they can't ignore. DOJ arrives Tuesday, Preach confirmed. Justice Watch has a contact on the investigation team. We need to get our records to them. Complete, unfiltered. Working on it. Medina's been essential, but she's under scrutiny. Kincaid suspects someone's leaking information. Their conversation ended abruptly as a guard called time on the recreation period. As they returned to their cells, Preach pressed something into Malik's palm, a small, tightly folded piece of paper. In the privacy of his cell, Malik carefully unfolded the note. In tiny, precise handwriting, Henson can be trusted. Library. Rotation Thursday. Officer Travis Henson sat in his parked car outside his apartment complex, rain drumming on the roof as he stared at his phone. The screenshots he'd taken of Kincaid's redacted disciplinary review. Evidence of a pattern that had been buried years ago, now resurfaced in the light of renewed scrutiny. The right thing to do was clear. Forward these to the DOJ investigation team. Add his testimony to the growing body of evidence against Lockridge's administration. The consequences were equally clear. His career in corrections would be over. No facility would hire a guard who had broken ranks, violated policy, betrayed the unwritten code of silence that protected those in uniform. A sharp tap on his window startled him from his thoughts. Through the rain-streaked glass, he recognized Officer Lisa Medina, hoodie pulled up against the downpour. He unlocked the doors and she slid into the passenger seat, water dripping from her jacket. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "I know you've been asking questions, accessing records. I know you're troubled by what's happening." Henson tensed. "Is this an official conversation? Are you reporting back to Kincaid?" "If I were Kincaid's informant, you'd already be fired." Medina pushed back her hood. "I think we're on the same side, Henson. The side that believes this job shouldn't require us to sacrifice our humanity. That's a dangerous side to be on at Lockridge. More dangerous to be on the other side, in the long run." Medina studied him. "I've seen you watching, listening. You're not like the others. You see what's happening and it bothers you." "It should bother everyone," Henson replied. "What Kincaid is doing, what we're all complicit in, it's not just wrong, it's illegal." "Then help us prove it." Henson's eyebrows rose. Us? There's a network, inside and outside the walls, people documenting abuses, building a case. The DOJ inquiry is just the beginning. You're part of this? You're the leak Kincaid's been raging about? One of them, Medina admitted. But we need more. Someone with access to different areas, different records. Someone like you. Henson hesitated. What you're asking could cost me my job, my future, and what will staying silent cost you? Your self-respect? Your ability to look in the mirror? Medina's eyes were intense. You were a soldier before this, right? Did you fight for a country where power means the right to abuse without consequence? The question hit home. Henson had joined the military with idealistic notions of service and justice, had transferred those same ideals to corrections, believing he could be part of a system that balanced security with humanity. What do you need from me? He asked finally. Medina smiled slightly. Thursday. Library rotation. Malik has documentation that needs to get to Justice Watch before the DOJ team arrives. Records that won't be in the official files Mercer shows them. Malik has been in segregation. How does he have documentation? He has his ways. The question is, will you help get it out? Rain continued to beat against the car roof, filling the silence as Henson weighed his decision. Yes, he said, at last. I'll help. Kincaid paced the small office adjacent to the control room, his usual composure fraying at the edges. Atwood sat in the corner, watching with a mixture of concern and calculation. The timing is too perfect, Kincaid fumed. Right when we're putting maximum pressure on them, suddenly there's a media campaign and a DOJ investigation. Someone's feeding information outside, Atwood agreed. Has to be staff. No inmate has that kind of access. Medina, Kincaid said, decisively. She's been sympathetic to Ramsey from the start, always volunteering for medical checks in the SHU. Could be Henson too, Atwood suggested. He's soft, always watching, asking questions. Or both. Kincaid stopped pacing. We need to know for certain before we move. Mercer's watching me, like a hawk looking for an excuse to throw me under the bus when DOJ arrives. I've got some contacts, Atwood said, lowering his voice. Outside brothers who could help us track their movements, check their communications. Kincaid gave him a sharp look. Your brotherhood connections stay outside these walls, understood? That's a complication I don't need right now. Just offering resources, Atwood shrugged. These race traders need to learn there are consequences for choosing the wrong side. Focus Red, first we confirm who's leaking, then we address it administratively. And Ramsey. Mercer's little de-escalation move puts him one step closer to rejoining his followers. Kincaid's face darkened. Ramsey thinks he's winning. Thinks his peaceful resistance strategy has us on the defensive. A cold smile spread across his features. We're going to show him how fragile peace really is. The library cart rotation was a weekly procedure. New books delivered to restricted housing units by the inmate library assistants under officer supervision. This Thursday, Officer Henson was assigned to escort the rotation through transitional housing. His heart pounded as he walked beside the book cart pushed by a younger inmate who had no idea of the risk Henson was taking. When they reached Malik's cell, the exchange was brief and seemingly routine. Malik handed over 2 books to be returned, selected 2 new ones from the cart. The folded papers were slipped between pages 43-44 of To Kill a Mockingbird, a symbolic choice that wasn't lost on Henson. Pages Malik had dog-eared slightly as a marker. Throughout the rotation, Henson maintained an air of bored professionalism, but his uniform shirt felt damp with nervous sweat. After completing the rounds, he escorted the cart and inmate assistant back to the library, then requested a bathroom break. In the staff restroom, he quickly extracted the papers from the book, photographed each page with his phone, then carefully returned them to their hiding place. The book would go back into circulation, the papers discovered and confiscated eventually, but by then the digital copies would be securely transmitted. That evening, from the privacy of his apartment, Henson forwarded the images to the secure email address Medina had provided. Malik's documentation was comprehensive. Dates, times, incidents, policy violations, all meticulously cross-referenced with federal regulations and case law. A legal roadmap for investigators, created by a man who had been isolated from legal resources for weeks. After sending the files, Henson sat for a long time staring at the screen of his laptop. There was no going back now. He had chosen his side in a war that had been waging long before he arrived at Lockridge. In the small office she shared with the prison's medical director, Lisa Medina carefully copied files from the facility's database to a secure drive. Staffing records, incident reports, medical documentation of inmate injuries, pieces of a puzzle that revealed a disturbing pattern when assembled. One document caught her attention, a disciplinary report filed by Officer Atwood that cited an inmate for possessing materials associated with radical racial ideology, the contraband in question, a dog-eared copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X, a book available in the prison library. She dug deeper, pulling up Atwood's personnel file. Nothing immediately suspicious, but certain patterns emerged. He had applied to Lockridge specifically, transferred from a state facility in Tennessee, with a recommendation letter from a former supervisor named Richard Wilson. On a hunch, she searched for Wilson in the system. He had worked at Lockridge briefly, resigning shortly before Atwood's arrival. Further research outside the prison databases revealed Wilson's social media presence, filled with thinly veiled white supremacist content and references to brotherhood activities. More connections emerged as she continued searching. Kincaid and Atwood frequently requested the same shift assignments. Both had been involved in a disproportionate number of use-of-force incidents with black inmates. Both had personnel complaints that had been reviewed and dismissed by the same administrators. The pattern was becoming clear. Not just individual prejudice, but an organized network operating within Lockridge's walls. A faction of guards with shared ideology, protecting each other, advancing their agenda through selective enforcement and targeted harassment. As Medina compiled this new evidence, a shadow fell across her desk. She looked up to find Warden Mercer standing in the doorway. "Working late, Officer Medina?" Medina kept her expression neutral as she casually minimized the files on her screen. "Just updating medical records, Warden. We're behind on monthly reports." Mercer stepped into the office, eyes scanning the desk, the computer, Medina's face. "You've been putting in a lot of overtime recently. Very dedicated." "Just doing my job." "Your job?" Mercer nodded slowly. "Which includes maintaining medical confidentiality, following proper channels for reporting concerns, respecting the chain of command." She leaned closer. "Tell me, Officer Medina, have you been fulfilling all aspects of your job description?" The threat was thinly veiled, but Medina had prepared for this moment. "Absolutely, Warden. Patient care and proper documentation are my priorities, especially with the DOJ visit coming up. I want to make sure our records are impeccable." Mercer studied her for a long moment. "The DOJ visit is precisely my concern. There seem to be misunderstandings about conditions here at Lockridge. Exaggerations, false narratives being spread by those with political agendas." "That sounds concerning," Medina replied noncommittally. "It is, particularly when staff might be contributing to those narratives, however inadvertently." Mercer straightened. "Just a friendly reminder that all press inquiries, all external communications about facility operations must go through my office, for everyone's protection." "Understood, Warden." "Good. I'm glad we had this chat." Mercer moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Medina? I'm reassigning you to administrative duties until the DOJ visit concludes. For your own protection, of course. With all these allegations flying around, it's best to have our most experienced staff handling the documentation." After Mercer left, Medina sat motionless, heart pounding. The message was clear. She was under suspicion, being isolated, removed from direct contact with inmates, particularly Malik Ramsey. She quickly finished copying the files she'd gathered, then wiped all traces of her search history from the system. Time was running out. The network she'd helped build needed to act quickly before Mercer and Kincaid could close ranks and control the narrative. Malik and Preach sat at a small table in the transitional housing day room, a chessboard between them serving as both activity and cover for their hushed conversation. "Medina's been reassigned," Preach informed him. "Restricted to administrative duties. No more direct contact." Malik absorbed this news with a slight nod. "They're tightening the circle, identifying potential threats. Henson's still in place for now, but he's taking significant risks." "The documentation got out?" "Confirmed. Justice Watch received it, along with the personnel records he found. DOJ investigators have been briefed." Malik moved a chess piece. "And the silent protest? Still holding?" "Mostly. Some cracks appearing, especially after Williams. But the core remains disciplined." "We need to consider next steps," Malik said, voice dropping even lower. "This phase is about exposure, bringing outside attention to bear, but there are risks." Preach raised an eyebrow. "What kind of risks?" "When cornered, men like Kincaid become desperate, dangerous. He'll try to provoke a violent response to justify a crackdown." Malik's eyes met Preach's. "We need to prepare for provocation without falling into the trap." "The younger brothers are already at their limit," Preach warned. "Bricks is holding them together, but one spark could ignite everything we've built." "Then we need to control the spark," Malik replied. "Choose the ground on which we stand." Preach studied the chessboard, then the man across from him. In the 3 weeks since Malik had been thrown into segregation, something had shifted in him. The educator was still there, but tempered now with something harder, more tactical. The philosopher had become a general, seeing not just the moral imperatives but the strategic necessities. "There's something else you should know," Preach said after a moment. Medina uncovered connections between Kincaid, Atwood, and white supremacist groups outside, not just personal prejudice, organized ideology. Malik absorbed this without visible reaction, but Preach could see his mind working, recalibrating strategies, adjusting plans. "That changes the calculus," Malik said finally. "This isn't just about exposing individual abuses of power. It's about dismantling a system of organized oppression. A system with roots and branches extending beyond these walls," Preach agreed, "which makes it more dangerous, and more important, to bring it down." "Check," Malik said, moving his bishop. The word carried weight beyond the game. As they continued playing, Kincaid appeared at the entrance to the day room, watching their interaction with cold calculation. He made no move to approach, simply observed, his presence a reminder of the constant surveillance under which they operated. "He's planning something," Preach murmured, sensing Kincaid's focused attention. "Yes," Malik agreed calmly, "but so are we." On the chessboard between them, pieces advanced and retreated in the ancient dance of strategic warfare. Beyond the board, a larger game unfolded, one with human lives as pieces and justice as the prize. Kincaid lingered a moment longer, then disappeared down the corridor, already setting in motion his plan to shatter the inmates' unity. A provocation designed to transform dignified resistance into chaotic violence. A trap that Malik, despite his foresight and planning, might not be able to prevent his followers from walking into. Darnell "Bricks" Wallace had earned his nickname through both his physique and temperament. Solid, immovable, capable of crushing resistance. In his 7 years at Lockridge, that reputation had kept him safe, intimidation serving as his shield, in an environment where perceived weakness invited predation. Today, however, as he mopped the corridor leading to the facility's administration offices, he felt exposed. The duty assignment had come unexpectedly, a last-minute change that pulled him from his regular kitchen detail, a change ordered directly by Sergeant Kincaid. "Hey, Wallace," a voice called from behind. "Looks like you missed a spot." Bricks didn't need to turn to identify the speaker. Kevin Slater, a foot soldier for the Aryan Brotherhood, serving 15 years for assault with a deadly weapon. his forearms decorated with Nordic symbols and swastikas poorly disguised as geometric patterns to bypass prison tattoo regulations. Didn't realize they had house slaves working admin now, Slater continued, deliberately stepping on the freshly mopped floor. Or did Kincaid want you where he could keep an eye on you? Everyone knows you're Ramsey's attack dog. Bricks kept mopping, his massive shoulders tense but his expression neutral. Beside Slater stood another white inmate Bricks didn't recognize. Younger, nervous-looking, but wearing the same smirk of racial superiority. Nothing to say, big man? Slater stepped closer. That silent treatment might work on the weak links, but we know what you are, just waiting for your chance to chimp out. The familiar rage rose in Bricks's chest. A lifetime of similar provocations, similar slurs, similar reminders that in the eyes of men like Slater, his humanity would always be conditional. Before Malik, before Preach, he would have already been swinging the mop handle at Slater's head. Consequences be damned. Now he continued working methodically, remembering Malik's words. They expect violence because it confirms what they believe about us. Strategic restraint terrifies them because it challenges their fundamental understanding of power. Slater, frustrated by the lack of response, kicked over Brick's bucket, sending dirty water spreading across the floor. Oops, he sneered. Better. Clean that up, boy. From the corner monitoring station, Officer Atwood watched with anticipation, hand casually resting on his radio. Down the corridor, a security camera pivoted slightly, its red light indicating active recording. Brick set down his mop and turned to face Slater directly for the first time. He towered over the other man, his physical presence alone a reminder of the violence he was choosing to withhold. You want me to swing first? Brick said quietly. Make their job easier. Slater's eyes flicked toward Atwood, then back to Brick's. The momentary glance confirmed what Bricks had already suspected. This was coordinated, a trap. I want you to know your place, Slater hissed, then abruptly shoved Bricks hard against the wall. For a suspended moment, the corridor was silent except for water dripping from the overturned bucket. Bricks remained still, back against the wall, fists clenched but not raised. Then Slater made his critical mistake. He pulled a homemade shank from his waistband, a toothbrush melted and embedded with a razor blade. The presence of the weapon changed the calculation instantly. This wasn't just a provocation, it was potentially lethal. Come on, big man, Slater taunted, blade glinting under the fluorescent lights. Show me what you got. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Brick sidestepped the first thrust, caught Slater's wrist and applied enough pressure to make the shank clatter to the floor. With his free hand, he delivered a single devastating punch to Slater's sternum, not to his face or head, which would suggest intent to seriously harm, but to disable without permanent injury. Slater crumpled, gasping for breath. The younger inmate backed away, hands raised. Bricks picked up the shank, looked directly at the camera, and deliberately placed the weapon on the floor before stepping away. He pulled first, Bricks said clearly for the recording. I defended myself with proportionate force. Only then did Atwood rush forward, radio in hand. Inmate fight in progress. Need backup in admin corridor B. As officers converged on the scene, Bricks allowed himself to be cuffed without resistance, his expression calm despite the chaos around him. He had recognized the trap and navigated it with precision, defending himself without succumbing to the blind rage Kincaid had been counting on. In that moment, something shifted within Darnell. Bricks Wallace. The rage that had defined him for so long hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. From a liability into a tool, wielded with conscious purpose rather than controlling him. Disciplinary report cites unprovoked assault on another inmate resulting in serious injury. Kincaid read aloud in Warden Mercer's office. Recommendation for immediate transfer to maximum security segregation pending criminal charges. Mercer frowned, reviewing the security camera footage on her monitor. This doesn't look unprovoked to me, Sergeant. Slater clearly initiated physical contact. The camera angle doesn't show everything, Kincaid insisted. Wallace has a history of violence. Slater claims Wallace threatened him earlier that day. And the weapon? The report doesn't mention that Slater pulled a shank. Planted after the fact, Kincaid countered smoothly. Wallace is trying to justify excessive force. Mercer paused the footage, studying the image closely. Where did this duty assignment come from? Wallace doesn't usually work administration. Areas. Staff shortage in housekeeping, Kincaid replied. We pulled inmates from other details. The office door opened, and Officer Travis Henson entered with a file folder. The duty roster you requested, Warden, he said, placing it on her. Duskett, thank you, Officer Henson. Mercer opened the folder, comparing the printed schedule with the information on her computer. According to this, Wallace was assigned to kitchen detail yesterday. The reassignment to administration doesn't appear in the official log. Kincaid's expression tightened. Clerical oversight. Things have been chaotic with the staffing shortages. And Slater's assignment to the same area, another oversight. I don't micromanage every inmate's movement, Warden. Mercer leaned back in her chair. 3 days before DOJ investigators arrive, a high-profile incident erupts between a black inmate connected to Ramsey and a known white supremacist gang member. Both mysteriously assigned to the same isolated area, outside their regular duties, with no documentation of the schedule change. Her voice was dangerously calm. Coincidence, Sergeant Kincaid? Are you accusing me of something, Warden? I'm pointing out a serious procedural discrepancy that could raise questions during our upcoming federal review. Mercer turned to Henson. Officer, what do you make of this situation? Henson hesitated, acutely aware of Kincaid's glare. The duty roster discrepancy is unusual, ma'am. Typically, all schedule changes are logged and approved by shift supervisors. And was this change logged? No, ma'am. I checked the system before bringing the file. Mercer's eyes returned to Kincaid. This incident requires formal internal affairs review, not just the fight, but the circumstances leading to it. Internal affairs? Kincaid scoffed. For a standard inmate altercation? For potential staff misconduct in manipulating inmate movements to create conflict. Mercer's tone was final. I'm calling Deputy Warden Torres to initiate the process. In the meantime, Wallace remains in general population. No segregation without conclusive evidence of policy violation. After Kincaid stormed out, Mercer gestured for Henson to stay. Officer, your attention to detail is commendable. Not everyone would have noticed or mentioned the roster discrepancy. Just doing my job, Warden. Indeed. Mercer studied him thoughtfully. As the newest member of our staff, your perspective is valuable. Less entrenched in established patterns. I'd like you to assist internal affairs with their preliminary review. Of course, Warden. As Henson left the office, he felt Mercer's eyes on his back, calculating, assessing. He wondered if she genuinely valued his perspective or was testing his loyalty, trying to determine which side he was on in the growing institutional divide. Either way, the opportunity to work with internal affairs could provide access to information the outside investigators would need. Another piece in the strategic puzzle Malik had set in motion. In transitional housing, Malik received news of the confrontation between Bricks and Slater through the prison's efficient grapevine. Preach filled in the details during their daily chess game in the day room. Bricks handled it perfectly, Preach concluded, defended himself without escalation, even made sure the camera caught Slater pulling the weapon first. And he's not in segregation? Malik asked, surprised. Warden intervened, ordered an internal investigation into how they both ended up assigned to the same area. Malik moved, a chess piece considering the implications. Mercer's protecting her position, not Bricks. With DOJ arriving next week, she can't afford obvious retaliation against our people. Still works in our favor, Preach observed. Kincaid miscalculated. Thought Bricks would lose control, give them justification for a mass lockdown. Because that's how he sees us, Malik nodded. Incapable of strategic restraint. It's why our discipline threatens him more than any physical confrontation could. Later that afternoon, Malik received permission to meet with a small group for what was officially logged as peer counseling. a program he'd established years earlier that allowed him to mentor younger inmates. Among the participants was Dexter Williams, recently released from suicide watch, his wrists still bandaged from his attempt. "The word is spreading about what Bricks did," Malik told the group, seated in a circle in the small transitional unit classroom. "How he defended himself without losing himself." "Man's always been a fighter," one young inmate commented. "Just didn't expect him to hold back with a Nazi pulling a shank on him." "That's exactly what they were counting on," Malik explained. "Violence would have justified a security crackdown, breaking our unity right when outside investigators are about to arrive. So we just let them push us? Let them disrespect us?" Williams asked, voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Where's the dignity in that?" "Dignity isn't in how we react," Malik replied gently. "It's in choosing our reaction rather than being manipulated into theirs." Bricks wasn't passive, he defended himself effectively. But he remained in control, denied them the narrative they wanted. The younger men exchanged glances, absorbing this perspective. For men raised in environments where respect was often tied to immediate, decisive retaliation against disrespect, this strategic approach to conflict represented a profound paradigm shift. "Power through restraint," Malik continued. "That's what terrifies them. Not our anger, they expect that. What they fear is our discipline, our unity, our refusal to be what they say we are." As the session concluded, Williams lingered behind. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for breaking, for trying to—" He gestured to his bandaged wrists. Malik placed a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't break, brother. You bent under impossible pressure. But you're still here, still standing with us. It just got to be too much. The restrictions, missing my son's birthday. I know. And your pain is part of what makes this fight necessary." Malik's voice was firm, but compassionate. "Your suffering isn't separate from our cause, it's at the heart of it. We're fighting for a world where men like you aren't pushed to that edge." Williams nodded, tears in his eyes. "I won't let you down again." "You never did," Malik assured him. "Now you're just stronger for having faced your darkest moment." As Williams left, Malik remained seated, contemplating the weight of responsibility he carried. These men looked to him not just for strategy but for meaning, a framework to understand their suffering and transform it into purpose. It was a responsibility he had never sought but could not abdicate. Not when lives and souls hung in the balance. Officer Lisa Medina worked methodically through administrative files, her reassignment keeping her isolated from direct inmate contact but providing unexpected access to documentation. While digitizing old incident reports, she discovered a pattern that connected Kincaid and Atwood to a series of suspicious injuries among black inmates over the past 5 years. Her desk phone rang, interrupting her research. "Medical records," Officer Medina speaking. "Lisa, it's Elena from Justice Watch." The voice was hushed, urgent. "We've got movement on our end. Internal Affairs is reviewing yesterday's incident, and my source says they're ordering a search of Kincaid's office. Tomorrow morning." Medina's pulse quickened. "Based on what?" "Inconsistencies in the duty roster, plus some documentation your friend Henson provided showing a pattern of manipulated assignments. They're looking for evidence that Kincaid deliberately created the confrontation." "When exactly is the search happening?" 8 a.m. after shift change, but before Kincaid's usual arrival. "I'll make sure our people know," Medina promised. "Anything specific they should look for?" "Personal communications, unofficial logs, anything connecting him to Atwood's outside associates. We have reason to believe Kincaid maintains records of his own, a parallel system for tracking his targets." After ending the call, Medina considered how to disseminate this information. Her restricted access meant she couldn't communicate directly with Malik or the others. She would need an intermediary. Officer Henson was the obvious choice, but approaching him directly might draw attention. Instead, she logged into the facility's digital medical record system and created a routine appointment notification for Malik Ramsey. Blood pressure check, scheduled for later that afternoon. In the notes section, she added coded language that would alert him to the impending search. As she completed the paperwork, the office door opened. Officer Atwood stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Working hard, Medina?" he asked, stepping into the small room. "Just catching up on documentation," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "Something I can help you with, Officer Atwood?" "Actually, yes." He closed the door behind him. "Been meaning to ask about your relationship with Officer Henson." "Professional colleagues," Medina answered carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Curious timing. You get reassigned to admin, suddenly he's noticing discrepancies in duty rosters." Atwood moved closer to her desk. "Makes a man wonder if you two are comparing notes." "We work in different departments, I barely see him." "That right?" Atwood leaned down, his face uncomfortably close to hers. "Because word is, you two had quite the conversation in his car last week, parked outside your apartment complex, in the rain." Very dramatic. Medina's blood ran cold, but she maintained her composure. "Is there a policy against staff discussing work concerns off-duty, Officer Atwood?" "Depends on the concerns, doesn't it?" His voice lowered. "Some things are internal matters, family business, not for outsiders to get involved in." "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Atwood straightened. "I'm telling you directly. You and your boy Henson are playing a dangerous game. There are lines in this facility that smart people don't cross." "Is that a threat?" "It's a professional courtesy." Atwood smiled coldly. "Consider yourself notified that your activities have been noticed." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Medina? Might want to be more careful about what calls you take on institutional phones. Never know who might be listening." After he left, Medina sat motionless, her mind racing. Atwood's message was clear. They were watching her, possibly monitoring her communications. The stakes had just been raised significantly, but so had the opportunity. The search of Kincaid's office could yield evidence that would connect all the pieces, if they knew what to look for and where to find it before items could be removed or destroyed. Carefully, using her personal phone rather than the office line, she sent a text message to Elena at Justice Watch. "Atwood knows. Possibly monitoring office phones. Proceed with caution." The machinery was in motion now. Internal and external pressure converging on Kincaid's carefully constructed system of control. But cornered predators were the most dangerous, and Medina had no illusions about what men like Kincaid and Atwood might do when their power was truly threatened. The provocation had failed, but the war was far from over. The DOJ investigation team arrived at Lockridge on a Tuesday morning. 3 men and 2 women in crisp suits carrying leather portfolios and expressions of professional detachment. Their government-issued SUVs pulled into reserved spaces near the administration building as staff and inmates alike watched through windows. Inside her office, Warden Elaine Mercer rehearsed her opening statement one final time before the mirror. 27 years in corrections had taught her that perception often mattered more than reality, especially when dealing with oversight committees. Today's performance needed to be flawless, confident without arrogance, concerned without defensiveness, transparent without overexposure. A knock at her door interrupted the practice session. "They're here, Warden," her assistant announced. "Being processed through security now." "Thank you. Have them escorted to the conference room. Coffee and water service, please." As her assistant left, Mercer's desk phone rang, an internal call from Sergeant Kincaid. "We have a situation," he said without preamble. "The search of my office this morning. Several files are missing." Mercer's carefully composed expression faltered. "What files?" "Personal notes, confidential informant records, nothing official." "Nothing official shouldn't have been in your office to begin with," she hissed. "What exactly was in these files?" "Documentation on problematic inmates, intelligence gathering, methods that wouldn't necessarily align with standard procedure." The implication was clear. Kincaid had maintained unofficial records of his targeting activities, potentially incriminating evidence now in unknown hands. "Fix this," Mercer ordered, "before those files reach our visitors. And Kincaid, if I Go down for your extracurricular activities. I'll make sure you never work in corrections again. Anywhere. Composing herself, she headed to the conference room to greet the investigators with a practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. In the staff lounge, Officer Travis Henson drank coffee that tasted like battery acid, trying to calm his nerves. In 20 minutes, he was scheduled to meet with the DOJ team, a routine interview according to the official notice. But both he and they knew it was much more. His testimony would directly implicate Sergeant Kincaid in systematic harassment and policy violations. Would connect Kincaid to Atwood, and Atwood to white supremacist organizations outside the prison walls. Would expose a cancer that had been growing inside Lockridge for years. Career suicide, almost certainly, but sitting across from him was a reminder of why it was necessary. Officer Lisa Medina's locker had been emptied that morning. A terse announcement had informed staff that she had been terminated for violation of confidentiality protocols and unauthorized access to restricted files. No hearing, no appeal. Gone within an hour of arriving for her shift. A message to anyone else considering breaking ranks. Officer Henson? The warden's assistant appeared in the doorway. They're ready for you now. As he walked to the conference room, Henson thought about what Malik had told him during a brief exchange in transitional housing. Truth is the ultimate act of resistance in a system built on lies. He straightened his shoulders and entered the room. Malik Ramsey sat on the edge of his bunk in transitional housing, a full breakfast tray untouched beside him. For the third consecutive day, he had accepted meals and returned them uneaten, a silent protest that had quickly spread throughout the facility. As word traveled through the inmate grapevine, the hunger strike had begun with Malik alone, expanded to include Preach and the other elder inmates, then rippled outward to encompass nearly 60% of Lockridge's black population. A deliberate escalation timed perfectly with the DOJ team's arrival. A guard appeared at his cell door. Medical check, Ramsey. Warden's orders. In the small medical office adjacent to transitional housing, a facility nurse took his vitals while a guard supervised. The nurse frowned at the blood. Pressure reading. "This is your third day refusing meals?" she asked, marking his chart. "I'm not refusing," Malik corrected calmly. "I'm accepting every meal. I'm simply choosing not to eat until certain conditions are addressed." Such as? Documented cases of racial harassment, inmate-on-inmate violence facilitated by staff, retaliation against those who report abuses. His voice remained measured, reasonable. "All issues I've raised through proper channels without response." The nurse glanced uncomfortably at the guard. "That's not really my department." "It's everyone's department," Malik replied, "especially now that outside eyes are watching." Back in his cell, Malik maintained the disciplined routine he'd established. Meditation, reading, writing detailed accounts of everything he'd witnessed and experienced. The physical discomfort of hunger was secondary to the clarity it provided, a reminder of purpose, of agency, even within confinement. His door opened again several hours later. This time, Officer Atwood entered alone, dismissing the regular unit guard with a gesture. "Playing the martyr, Ramsey?" Atwood leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "This hunger strike bullshit. Real original." Malik said nothing, watching Atwood with calm attentiveness. "You think you've won something here?" Atwood continued, voice dropping. "Got the feds sniffing around, got Mercer running scared. But you're making a fundamental mistake. You think this is about policy violations, about rules being broken. It's not." "What is it about then, Officer Atwood?" Malik asked quietly. "War." Atwood's eyes hardened. "A war that's been going on long before you got here, and will continue long after you're gone. Inside these walls, outside in the streets, everywhere. Racial war, you mean? Call it whatever you want, natural order, protecting our own. The point is, men like me, men like Kincaid, we're soldiers. We understand what's at stake." "And what is that exactly?" Atwood stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Everything, our country, our heritage, our future. You people think you can change the rules, rewrite history. But there are more of us than you know, In every prison, every police department, every government office. Malik met his gaze steadily. That sounds like an admission of organized criminal activity, Officer Atwood. Perhaps something the DOJ team would be interested in hearing. You think I'm worried about some liberal bureaucrats? Atwood laughed. System protects its own. Always has. Not always, Malik replied. Systems evolve, adapt, especially when their corruption is exposed to light. Atwood's expression darkened. You've got everyone fooled with this Peaceful Resistance Act, this dignity bullshit. But I know what you really are. And what's that? A threat. One that needs to be eliminated, not just contained. Atwood moved toward the door. Enjoy your hunger strike, Ramsey. Maybe you'll get lucky and starve before we have to handle this directly. After Atwood left, Malik remained motionless on his bunk, processing the encounter. Atwood's direct threats confirmed what Medina had discovered. This wasn't just about individual prejudice or abuse of power. It was organized, ideological, systematic. And now they were desperate enough to show their hand openly. In the conference room, Travis Henson sat before the DOJ investigative team, hours into his testimony. What had begun as a standard interview had evolved into a comprehensive deposition as the team recognized the value of his perspective. A recent hire with military background, documenting everything he'd witnessed with methodical precision. And you believe Sergeant Kincaid deliberately arranged the confrontation between inmates Wallace and Slater? Asked Victoria Hamilton, the lead investigator. The evidence supports that conclusion, Henson replied. Unauthorized duty reassignments, missing documentation, the presence of a weapon that shouldn't have been possible to obtain in that section of the facility. Were you pressured by Warden Mercer regarding your testimony today? Henson hesitated briefly. She suggested that raising certain issues might complicate the facility's relationship with the Bureau of Prisons. That career advancement often depends on being a team player. Hamilton made a note. Let's discuss Officer Atwood. You mentioned connections between him and external organizations? Yes. The personnel files I provided show a pattern of transfers and recommendations connecting him to facilities with documented white supremacist staff presence. Additionally, his social media activity, while careful, contains coded language associated with several recognized extremist groups. And Sergeant Kincaid's relationship with Atwood? They work the same shifts whenever possible. Kincaid has approved every disciplinary action Atwood has initiated, despite some being clearly excessive. They meet privately off-site, based on what Officer Medina and I observed. Hamilton leaned forward. Speaking of Officer Medina, her termination this morning. Your thoughts? Retaliatory, Henson stated firmly. She had access to medical records documenting injuries inconsistent with official incident reports. She was building a case showing disparate treatment based on race. Do you know where she is now? No, but I believe she compiled copies of key documentation before her termination. Hamilton nodded. Officer Henson, you understand the potential consequences of your testimony today. This isn't just about administrative reforms. I understand. This is about criminal conduct operating under color of authority, about a corrupted system that enables and protects it. Henson met her gaze directly. I took an oath to uphold the law when I became a correctional officer. That oath doesn't include protecting those who systematically violate it. Outside the conference room, Warden Mercer paced the corridor, periodically checking her watch. Henson's interview had been scheduled for 1 hour. It was now approaching 4. On her phone, a string of increasingly urgent text messages from contacts in Washington indicated that Lockridge was becoming a political liability. Phrases like optics concern and media interest peppered the communications. The final message was the most direct. Damage control needed immediately. Report to DC Thursday. Inside, Henson's testimony concluded with a detailed timeline of events since Malik's initial segregation, the silent protest, the escalating retaliation, William's suicide attempt, the manufactured confrontation between Bricks and Slater. A comprehensive picture of a facility where control had been maintained through systematic intimidation and abuse, now fracturing under exposure. The leaked footage appeared online Wednesday morning, 2 minutes and 17 seconds of Officer Atwood in Malik's cell, captured by a small camera hidden in a vent. The audio was clear enough to catch every word of his threats, his references to organized white supremacist presence in law enforcement and corrections. By noon, it had been viewed over 50,000 times. By evening, national news networks were running segments titled Prison Corruption Exposed and Racial Targeting in Federal Facility. Inside Lockridge, the impact was immediate and dramatic. Warden Mercer ordered Atwood suspended pending investigation. Sergeant Kincaid was restricted to administrative duties, prohibited from direct inmate contact. Additional officials from the Bureau of Prisons arrived to support the DOJ team, expanding the investigation's scope. In a secluded diner 30 miles from the prison, Lisa Medina met with Victoria Hamilton and 2 other DOJ investigators, providing the files she had methodically gathered over weeks: medical records, incident reports, personnel files, and most crucially, copies of Kincaid's unofficial documentation of targeted harassment campaigns against specific inmates. He kept records? Hamilton asked, examining the papers with disbelief. Kincaid's meticulous, Medina explained, believes in documenting his successes. These show coordinated efforts to provoke reactions from specific inmates, mostly black, mostly associated with Malik Ramsey. This is extraordinarily helpful, Ms. Medina. Would you be willing to provide formal testimony? That's why I'm here, Medina replied. But there's more you should know. The network Kincaid and Atwood are part of extends beyond Lockridge. They have connections in at least 3 other facilities that I've confirmed, possibly more. A larger conspiracy, Hamilton nodded thoughtfully. We've seen indications. Your documentation may provide the links we've been missing. Medina hesitated. What about protection? Atwood made it clear they know I was gathering information. We can arrange security during the investigation. Afterward, possibly witness protection if necessary. Hamilton's expression was sympathetic, but realistic. I won't minimize the risk you've taken, Ms. Medina, or the service you've provided. I'm not the hero in this story, Medina replied. The inmates sustaining a peaceful resistance despite everything thrown at them. They're the ones showing real courage. By Thursday morning, the hunger strike had spread to 87 inmates. Medical staff reported concerning vital signs in several participants, including Malik, now in his 5th day without food. National civil rights organizations issued statements of support. Religious leaders called for accountability. Social media campaigns demanded justice for Lockridge inmates. The pressure had become too much for the system to contain. Warden Mercer departed for Washington, leaving Deputy Warden Torres temporarily in charge. Before leaving, she made a final attempt to end the hunger strike, visiting Malik in transitional housing. What do you want, Ramsey? She asked, without preamble. What will it take to end this before someone dies and it becomes a federal case? Malik, visibly thinner but clear-eyed, responded with the calm certainty that had become his trademark. Justice isn't negotiable, Warden. This isn't about making deals. Everything is negotiable in corrections. Name your terms. Independent. Investigation of all claims of racial harassment and excessive force. Removal of implicated staff pending results. Policy reforms with enforceable oversight. Protection from retaliation for those who testified. Mercer's expression hardened. You're not in a position to dictate institutional policy, Ramsey. Look around you, Warden. Malik replied softly. I'm not dictating anything. Reality is, the truth you've tried to suppress for years is finally speaking for itself. After she left, Malik returned to his meditation practice, centered despite physical weakness. The battle was approaching its climax, Kincaid and his allies cornered, the system's protective mechanisms failing, outside attention focused on long-hidden abuses. But he harbored no illusions about the danger. Cornered predators were most dangerous in their final moments, when the pretense of civilization fell. A way to reveal the raw desperation beneath. In his office, stripped of authority but still technically employed, Sergeant Ray Kincaid stared at his computer screen, watching his career and reputation disintegrate in real time as news coverage expanded. 22 years of service reduced to headlines about corruption and racism. His phone vibrated with a text from Atwood. Plan B, clock's ticking. Kincaid's jaw tightened as he typed his response. Tomorrow, we finish this. The breaking point had arrived, not just for the institution, but for the man who had shaped it in his image. And in that breaking, the true measure of both would finally be revealed. Dawn broke over Lockridge Federal Penitentiary, painting the razor wire in golden light that belied the darkness gathering inside its walls. In the administrative wing, Sergeant Ray Kincaid arrived unusually early, nodding to the night shift. Guards with forced casualness as he made his way to the security office. Inside, he locked the door and retrieved a small package from inside his uniform jacket. Handwritten notes on prison letterhead, carefully aged and folded to suggest clandestine passing between inmates. The contents detailed plans for coordinated violence, food service sabotage, and hostage-taking, a riot blueprint with Malik Ramsey and Darnell Wallace listed as primary organizers. Meticulously, Kincaid photographed the fabricated evidence, then logged into the facility's digital security system. Using his supervisor credentials, he uploaded the images to a backdated incident report, creating a documentary trail suggesting the riot plans had been intercepted 3 days earlier, but not yet processed due to investigative sensitivity. This ends today, he muttered, finalizing the report and marking it for immediate administrative review. His phone vibrated with a text from Officer Atwood. In position. D-block sweep ready when you give word. Kincaid responded, 0900 hours. Joint cell search. Target cells marked in system. The plan was simple in its desperation. Simultaneous raids on cells belonging to Malik, Bricks, and 3 other inmates connected to the resistance. The planted evidence would justify immediate maximum security segregation for all of them, effectively decapitating the movement before the DOJ investigation could progress further. In their isolation, without leadership, the remaining inmates would fracture, returning to the racial divisions and survival-focused individualism that had defined Lockridge before Malik's influence took hold. Order restored through chaos, just as Kincaid had always maintained it. As he exited the security office, he failed to notice the small red light on the ceiling camera, a system normally monitored only by security staff now being actively observed by DOJ technical specialists who had quietly established monitoring protocols throughout the facility the previous evening. In the chapel, the morning prayer group gathered as usual, a mix of inmates from different housing units coming together for a brief service before the day's routines began. Preach led the gathering, his bass voice carrying through the small room as he read from Psalms. When the reading concluded, a younger inmate named Rodriguez, no relation to the stabbing victim from weeks earlier, approached Preach with an urgent whisper. CO Jenkins heard something on shift change. Raid planned for D-block and transitional, targeting Teach, Bricks, and the others. Got some kind of evidence they're calling riot plans. Preach kept his expression neutral as he absorbed this information. When? 9 a.m., full tactical sweep. Thank you, brother. Preach replied softly. Return to your seat. Reveal nothing in your face. As the service continued, Preach casually scanned the chapel. In the back row, Officer Henson stood at his usual post, maintaining a respectful distance from the religious gathering while fulfilling his security duties. After the final prayer, as inmates filed out, Preach lingered to organize prayer books, a routine task that allowed him to be the last one remaining. As Henson prepared to escort him back to his unit, Preach spoke without looking up. Kincaid's making his move. Fabricated riot plans. Cell raids at 9. Ramsey and Wallace primary targets. Henson stiffened almost imperceptibly. How certain is this information? Certain enough. He's desperate. Nothing left to lose. Understood, Henson replied quietly. I'll handle it. Rather than escorting Preach directly to his housing unit, Henson took a route that passed near the administration building where the DOJ team had established their temporary offices. As they walked, he keyed his radio. Officer Henson to control. Escorting inmate from Chapel to D Block. Need to make a stop at admin for medication pickup. Authorization requested. Control to Henson. Approved for admin stop. Inside the administration building, Henson guided Preach to a bench in the corridor. Wait here. Medical will bring your prescription. Instead of approaching the medical office, however, Henson knocked at the door marked Conference Room A, current headquarters for the DOJ investigation team. Victoria Hamilton was reviewing testimony transcripts when the knock came at the conference room door. The correctional officer who entered, Henson, she recalled from yesterday's extensive interview, looked considerably more tense than during their previous meeting. We have a situation developing, he said without preamble. Sergeant Kincaid has fabricated evidence of a riot plot allegedly organized by Ramsey and Wallace. He's planning coordinated cell raids at 0900 hours to discover this evidence and isolate the resistance leadership. Hamilton checked her watch, 8:17 a.m. You're certain of this? Information came through reliable inmate channels, consistent with Kincaid's established pattern of manufacturing pretexts for targeted segregation. Hamilton exchanged glances with her colleagues before turning back to Henson. Thank you, officer. We'll address this immediately. After Henson left, Hamilton activated the secure line to the Bureau of Prisons oversight team that had arrived the previous evening. This is Hamilton. We need immediate access to the security office surveillance archives. Focus on early morning activity today, specifically anything involving Sergeant Kincaid. And I want a directive issued temporarily suspending all cell search, authorizations pending DOJ review. Within minutes, the team's technical specialist confirmed what Henson had reported, video showing Kincaid manipulating documents, uploading backdated reports, text communications coordinating a targeted operation. We've got him on camera, tampering with evidence, falsifying reports, the specialist reported, forwarding the footage to Hamilton's tablet. Textbook obstruction. Hamilton nodded grimly. Alert internal affairs and have them meet us at the security office. It's time to end this. Sergeant Kincaid was reviewing the tactical plan for the cell raids when the security office door opened without a knock. Deputy Warden Torres entered, followed by 2 internal affairs officers and Victoria Hamilton from the DOJ team. Sergeant Kincaid, Torres began formally. I'm here to inform you that you're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation into serious allegations of misconduct. Kincaid's expression hardened. What allegations? Hamilton stepped forward. Falsification of evidence, tampering with official records, conspiracy to violate inmates' civil rights, obstruction of a federal investigation. She placed a tablet on the desk, screen displaying a still image from the security footage captured earlier that morning. We have you on camera creating fraudulent evidence to frame inmates Ramsey and Wallace. This is absurd, Kincaid scoffed, though his complexion had paled visibly. I was processing legitimate intelligence about a security threat. Intelligence dated 3 days ago that somehow materialized in the system 90 minutes ago? Hamilton raised an eyebrow. Your text communications with Officer Atwood have also been recovered, detailing your plan for coordinated cell raids to discover this evidence. Kincaid's eyes darted between the faces watching him, searching for a sympathetic ally and finding none. The protective shield of institutional loyalty that had insulated him for decades had vanished overnight. I want a union representative, he said finally, and legal counsel. Both will be provided, Torres assured him coolly, after you surrender your credentials, equipment, and facility access card. As Kincaid reluctantly complied, one of the internal affairs officers received an urgent radio call. His expression changed as he listened. Then he turned to Torres and Hamilton. We have a situation in D Block. Officer Atwood has engaged in an unauthorized cell search and is currently involved in a physical altercation with an inmate. Darnell Bricks Wallace was reading in his cell when Officer Atwood appeared at the door, accompanied by 2 rookie guards who looked uncomfortable with the unscheduled intrusion. Surprise inspection, Wallace, Atwood announced. Unlock code. Already entered. Step out and assume the position. Bricks placed his book down slowly. There's no scheduled search today. Did I ask for your opinion? Out. Now. Something in Atwood's demeanor, the barely contained fury, the recklessness, triggered Brick's instincts for danger. This wasn't a standard harassment. This was something more volatile. Following hard-learned prison wisdom, he complied, stepping into the corridor and assuming the wall-facing search stance. Better to weather whatever was coming than escalate without witnesses or protection. Atwood directed the rookie officers to begin searching the cell, then leaned in close to Bricks. "Your boy Ramsey thinks he's won," he whispered. "Thinks his little hunger strike and peaceful resistance bullshit has changed anything. But men like me will always be here, Wallace. In every prison, every police force. The system belongs to us." Bricks remained silent, focusing on his breathing. As Atwood's search grew increasingly destructive, mattress slashed open, books thrown to the floor, family photos torn from their careful arrangement on the small desk. "Sir," one of the rookie officers interjected nervously, "we should document before disarranging the cell this way." "Shut up and keep searching," Atwood snapped. "Check under the sink, behind the toilet." "What exactly are we looking for?" the other rookie asked. "You'll know when you find it," Atwood replied, frustration mounting as the search yielded nothing incriminating. From the corner of his eye, Bricks noticed other inmates gathering at their cell doors, witnessing the scene unfolding. Several floor security cameras had rotated to focus on the disturbance, their red recording lights active. Abruptly, Atwood grabbed a book from the floor, a copy of Richard Wright's Native Son that Malik had given Bricks years earlier. He flipped through it aggressively, then produced a folded paper from his pocket. Well, what do we have here?" He made a show of discovering the paper between pages, unfolding it to reveal what appeared to be handwritten notes. The rookie nearest him frowned. "Sir, that wasn't in the book when I checked it." Atwood's head snapped toward the young officer. "Are you calling me a liar, Jenkins?" "No, sir, You just what? Decided to take the side of inmates over a senior officer?" Atwood's voice rose as his plan disintegrated before him. "This is what's wrong with corrections today. No loyalty. No understanding of what we're really fighting for." An announcement crackled over the PA system. "Code Blue D-Block, all available officers respond, Code Blue D-Block." Atwood, realizing he'd lost control of the situation, made a final desperate decision. He lunged at Bricks, shoving him hard against the wall. "Resisting search," he shouted, raising his baton. "Inmate non-compliance." But Bricks didn't take the bait. Even as Atwood's baton connected with his shoulder, he maintained his position, hands visible, offering no resistance that could justify escalation. "Look at me!" Atwood screamed, his facade of professional control completely shattered. "Fight back, you coward!" When Bricks still refused to engage, Atwood's rage found its ultimate expression. "You fucking animals think you deserve rights?" he shouted, a stream of racial slurs following as he continued his unprovoked assault. The rookie officers backed away in shock as response teams flooded the tier. Within moments, Atwood found himself surrounded by fellow officers, many wearing the expressions of men seeing a colleague's true nature for the first time. "Officer Atwood," the response team leader ordered, "stand down immediately." Atwood turned, baton still raised, wild-eyed and suddenly aware of the multiple cameras recording every moment of his breakdown. Of the dozens of witnesses, inmates, and officers alike observing his public self-destruction. "You don't understand," he said desperately. "They're trying to take over. It's all coordinated. Kincaid knows. We have proof." "Put down the baton," the team leader repeated. "That's an order." When Atwood hesitated, two officers moved in swiftly, disarming and restraining him as he continued to shout increasingly incoherent justifications interspersed with explicit racial invective that removed any doubt about his motivations. As they led him away, Bricks finally turned from the wall, rubbing his bruised shoulder. The rookie officer named Jenkins approached cautiously. "Medical assistance is coming," he said quietly. "I want to formally state that I witnessed Officer Atwood plant evidence and initiate unprovoked physical contact. Bricks nodded, understanding the significance of an officer breaking ranks to speak truth. Appreciated. From down the tier, Preach appeared, returning from his chapel service in time to witness the aftermath. His eyes met Brick's, a silent communication passing between them, recognition that the turning point had arrived, that the system's contradictions had finally collapsed under their own weight. By mid-afternoon, Lockridge Federal Penitentiary had entered an unprecedented state of institutional limbo. Sergeant Kincaid had been escorted from the facility, credentials suspended pending criminal investigation. Officer Atwood had been taken into custody by county authorities on assault charges, his meltdown witnessed by enough staff to make institutional cover-up impossible. Most significantly, an email from Bureau of Prisons headquarters to all Lockridge staff announced that Warden Elaine Mercer had submitted her resignation effective immediately to pursue other opportunities. Bureaucratic language that fooled no one. In transitional housing, Malik Ramsey received word of these developments from Deputy Warden Torres personally. "The hunger strike can end now, Ramsey," Torres said, standing at the threshold of Malik's cell. "Changes are being implemented. DOJ will maintain oversight during the transition." Malik, now in his 6th day without food, regarded Torres thoughtfully. "Changes meaning what, specifically?" "Kincaid and Atwood are gone. Mercer, too. Internal Affairs is reviewing all disciplinary actions from the past 5 years. Policy reforms are being drafted with federal oversight." Torres hesitated, then added with reluctant respect, "You made your point." "The point was never about individuals," Malik replied. "It was about systems, structures, the culture that allowed them to operate unchecked for so long. Reform takes time. So does rebuilding trust." Malik's voice remained steady despite his physical weakness. "The hunger strike ends when I can address all participants directly, in the yard, so they can hear it from me that their sacrifice mattered." Torres considered this request, weighing security concerns against practical realities. The facility was already in unprecedented territory. Standard protocols seemed increasingly irrelevant. 1 hour tomorrow morning with appropriate security. And my return to general population? Medical evaluation first. Then yes, assuming you're physically stable. After Torres left, Malik closed his eyes, allowing himself to fully absorb the magnitude of what had occurred. Not a complete victory, the deeper structures of injustice remained intact, but a significant breach in the walls of institutional impunity. A breach created not through violence or chaos, but through disciplined, strategic resistance, through dignity maintained under nearly unbearable pressure. The next morning dawned clear and cool, autumn finally tempering Mississippi's brutal heat. In the main yard, nearly 300 inmates gathered in unprecedented assembly, security, staff maintaining a cautious perimeter without intervening. Malik Ramsey walked slowly from the administration building, still weakened from his hunger strike, but moving with deliberate dignity. At his side walked Officer Travis Henson, a symbolic choice that communicated volumes about the shifting dynamics within Lockridge's walls. As Malik crossed the yard, a remarkable transformation occurred. Inmates who had been talking fell silent. Those who had been seated stood. A wave of respectful quiet spread outward from his path until the entire yard had fallen into the now familiar silence that had defined their resistance. Near the weight pile, Malik spotted Bricks, his powerful frame positioned protectively near Dexter Williams and other younger inmates who had struggled most during the weeks of pressure. Preach stood nearby, Bible in hand, a slight nod acknowledging Malik's approach. When Malik reached the center of the yard, he raised his hands slightly, not in triumph, but in recognition of the collective achievements surrounding him. "Brothers," he began, voice carrying across the silent yard, "today we begin the process of eating again, of rebuilding our strength, of continuing the work that remains before us." A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the crowd. What we accomplished wasn't just about removing individuals who abused their power. It was about demonstrating our humanity in a system designed to deny it, about reclaiming dignity where others sought to strip it away. Malik paused, scanning the faces around him. Men who had endured decades of systematic dehumanization, yet had found the discipline to resist without descending into the violence their oppressors had tried to provoke. The path forward won't be easy. Systems resist change. Power reorganizes itself. But we've shown what's possible when we refuse to be what they say we are. When we choose strategic discipline over reactive rage. Brick stepped forward, his deep voice carrying across the yard. Teach showed us a different kind of strength, he addressed the gathered men. Not just the strength to fight back, but the harder strength to fight smart, to turn their expectations against them. This public acknowledgement from Bricks, known for years as a man of physical power rather than strategic patience, carried profound weight. A visible transformation in the yard's most respected enforcer signaled a broader shift in what leadership and strength would mean in Lockridge's new reality. As the assembly concluded, inmates returned to their units in the same disciplined silence that had defined their resistance, a reminder that their power remained intact, available if needed again. Malik, walking back toward the medical unit where he would begin the careful process of reintroducing food, felt something he had not experienced in years. Not freedom, not yet, but its necessary precursor, the reclamation of human dignity within walls designed to crush it. Behind him, the system that had seemed so impenetrable just weeks earlier lay fractured, not destroyed, but fundamentally altered. The first cracks had appeared in Lockridge's foundation, and through those cracks, the possibility of transformation had entered like light through granite. 6 weeks after what inmates now simply called the fall, autumn had fully claimed Mississippi. Through the windows of the prison library, Malik Ramsey could see leaves drifting across the yard, a gentle rain blurring the razor wire's harsh outline against the gray sky. The library had once again become his domain, restored to the educational sanctuary he had built over years. Attendance had tripled since his return to general population. Men who had never shown interest in books now appeared regularly, drawn not just by the knowledge offered but by proximity to the figure whose quiet resistance had fundamentally altered Lockridge's power structure. "Legal correspondence for you, Mr. Ramsey," announced the new library assistant, placing an official envelope on Malik's desk. Malik nodded his thanks, recognizing the Bureau of Prisons letterhead. Inside was a single-page notification that would have seemed miraculous just months earlier. Based on exceptional institutional adjustment, demonstrated leadership, and strong community support, inmate Malik Ramsey, Regime 4437-9019, has been recommended for special parole consideration under BOP Directive 5280.1. Initial hearing scheduled for December 12. Early release. After serving just 7 years of his 12-year sentence, a path to freedom had unexpectedly opened before him. Malik placed the letter in his folder, his expression revealing nothing as inmates continued their quiet research around him. Offer represented everything he had worked toward for years: return to his community, resumption of his teaching career, reconnection with family. Yet something gave him pause. A recognition that timing and context transformed this opportunity into a complex decision rather than a simple gift. A knock at the library entrance interrupted his thoughts. Interim Warden Daniels, formerly a regional BOP administrator, appointed to oversee Lockridge's transition after Mercer's resignation, stood in the doorway. "Got a moment, Ramsey?" In the small office adjacent to the library, Daniels closed the door and gestured to a chair, a small courtesy that would have been unthinkable under previous leadership. "I see legal sent over your parole notification," he began, nodding toward the folder in Malik's hand. "Yes, sir." "Congratulations. Are in order. It's an unusual recommendation for someone with your offense category, but the circumstances are exceptional." Daniels leaned forward slightly. "I wanted to discuss next steps personally." "I appreciate that, Warden. Your hearing is scheduled for December, but given the high-profile nature of recent events, approval is essentially guaranteed. You could be home by Christmas." Malik nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than elated. You don't seem particularly excited, Daniels observed. Freedom is always cause for celebration, Malik replied carefully. The timing is what concerns me. Meaning? Meaning that this facility is at a fragile moment of transition. The old order has collapsed, but the new one is still taking shape. Malik met Daniels' gaze directly. I wonder if my sudden departure might be interpreted as strategic. Daniels leaned back, understanding dawning in his eyes. You think it would look like we're removing you to neutralize your influence, buying your silence with early release. It would create that perception, yes, whether accurate or not. And this concerns you because what happened here isn't about me, Malik explained. It's about a system being forced to confront its fundamental failings. My individual freedom, while precious to me personally, is secondary to the structural changes still taking root. Daniel studied Malik with newfound respect. You're considering declining parole. I'm considering what serves the greater good. The transition happening here at Lockridge could become a model for other facilities, but only if it's genuine and sustainable. Most men would grab freedom and never look back, Daniels noted. I'm not most men, Malik replied simply. And this isn't just about me walking free. It's about ensuring that what we fought for doesn't evaporate once the spotlight moves elsewhere. As their conversation concluded, Daniels extended his hand, another small gesture signifying monumental change in how Lockridge's leadership viewed those in their custody. Whatever you decide, Ramsey, I respect the thought behind it. Not many people place principle above personal benefit. After Daniels left, Malik returned to the library desk, the parole letter heavy with possibility in his pocket. Around him, men bent over books and legal documents, the quiet concentration a testament to what could flourish when dignity replaced fear as an institutional foundation. The choice before him wasn't simple, but it was clear. Immediate personal freedom, or the chance to shepherd a transformation that could reshape lives beyond his own. The teacher in him already knew which path he would choose. In a Washington, D.C. conference room, Lisa Medina reviewed the final draft of the Department of Justice report on Lockridge Federal Penitentiary. Hired as a special consultant to the Civil Rights Division, she had spent weeks helping investigators connect the dots between individual incidents and systemic failures. The report's conclusions were devastating in their clarity. Investigation reveals a pervasive pattern of racially motivated mistreatment, excessive disciplinary measures, and institutional retaliation against inmates who attempted to utilize grievance procedures. Of particular concern was the identification of coordinated efforts among certain staff members to target specific inmate populations based on racial animus. Victoria Hamilton entered, coffee cups in hand. Final revisions complete? Just finished, Medina confirmed, accepting the coffee gratefully. Publication next week? Tuesday, press conference to follow. Hamilton took a seat across from her. The Bureau of Prisons is already implementing our recommended reforms at 3 other facilities with similar demographic profiles and complaint patterns. And the criminal cases? Grand jury indictments came through yesterday for Kincaid and Atwood. Conspiracy against rights, deprivation of rights under color of law, obstruction of justice. Hamilton smiled slightly. Your documentation was instrumental. The personal records Kincaid kept provided a roadmap of constitutional violations, spanning years. Medina nodded, a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness washing over her. She had given 15 years to corrections work, believing in the possibility of a humane system despite daily evidence to the contrary. The collapse of her career had paradoxically opened the door to more meaningful impact than she'd ever achieved, inside. I spoke with Travis Henson yesterday, Hamilton mentioned. He's starting law school in January. Said his experience at Lockridge convinced him to pursue civil rights litigation. Good for him, Medina replied. He took a significant, risk coming forward when he did. As did you. Hamilton studied her thoughtfully. The Attorney General is creating a new oversight division focused specifically on correctional reform. They're looking for people with first-hand experience and demonstrated ethical commitment. I've recommended you for a senior position. Medina's eyebrows rose in surprise. That's unexpected. Is it? You sacrificed your career to expose systemic injustice. You documented everything meticulously. You understood the institutional dynamics better than any external investigator could. Have. Hamilton shrugged. Seems like exactly the perspective needed to create meaningful oversight. Later, walking along the National Mall as evening fell, Medina reflected on the strange path that had led her from prison medical officer to potential architect of correctional reform. The cost had been high. Career destroyed, professional relationships severed, even personal safety temporarily compromised. Yet watching the sunset paint the monuments in golden light, she felt something that had eluded her throughout her corrections career. The sense that change, while difficult and imperfect, was genuinely possible when enough people refused to accept comfortable lies about necessary evils. Her phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number, containing only a quote. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Margaret Mead. Below it, a simple signature. Monsieur Ramsey. Medina smiled, pocketing the phone as she continued her walk through the gathering darkness, her path illuminated by the lights of monuments to imperfect justice. Reminders that the arc of history bent not of its own accord, but through the deliberate pressure of those unwilling to accept its current trajectory. Darnell Bricks Wallace stood in the center of Lockridge's newly established community leadership room, formerly an unused storage area, now converted into a meeting space for inmate-led programs. Around him sat 15 men of varying ages, backgrounds and sentences united by a common interest in what Bricks had begun calling strategic existence. Institution gives us two options, he explained, massive arms folded across his chest. Violence or submission, fighting the system or surrendering to it. What Teach showed us is that there's a third way, strategic resistance through disciplined dignity. A younger inmate raised his hand. But we won, right? Kincaid and them are gone. What are we resisting now? The system didn't disappear when Kincaid left, Bricks replied. It adapted. It's always adapting. Our job is to keep adapting too, to maintain what we've gained while pushing for what remains broken. The discussion continued, ranging from practical matters like conflict resolution techniques to philosophical questions about justice and accountability. Throughout, Bricks guided rather than dominated, encouraging participation from quieter members, challenging oversimplifications, modeling the leadership style he had absorbed from Malik over years of observation. After the session, as participants filed out, Preach remained behind, regarding Bricks with quiet approval. You found your calling, brother, he observed. Never thought I'd see the day when Bricks Wallace would be quoting Gandhi and King. Bricks laughed, a deep rumble that had once intimidated but now more often encouraged. Life comes at you in strange ways. 3 months ago, I'd have handled Slater very differently, and where would we be now if you had? Exactly, Bricks nodded. Chess, not checkers. Teach was right all along. Together they walked toward the yard for afternoon recreation, the same yard where, weeks earlier, Malik had addressed the silent assembly after Kincaid's removal. The space felt different now, less oppressive despite the unchanged walls and wire, as if the very atmosphere had been altered by the collective assertion of humanity that had occurred there. You heard about Teach's parole offer? Preach asked, as they crossed the open space. Yeah, he's turning it down? That's the word. Says his work here isn't finished. Bricks shook his head in amazement. Man's been fighting to get out since day one, now has the door open and chooses to stay. That's a different kind of strength. The strongest prison is the one inside your mind, Preach replied. Teach figured out how to be free even in here. Now he's showing others the way. As they reached the weight pile, the conversation shifted to more immediate concerns. The integration of housing units previously segregated by race, the restructuring of work assignments to eliminate preferential treatment, the ongoing presence of DOJ monitors ensuring reform commitments were honored, small changes accumulating toward transformation. The long game unfolding one day, one policy, one mind at a time. On a crisp December morning, Malik sat at his desk in the library, completing a letter that had taken weeks to craft. Not a legal appeal or institutional grievance, but something more personal and possibly more consequential. A letter to his former high school students, now young adults navigating a world he had been absent from for 7 years. The final paragraph flowed from his pen with careful deliberation. Remember when I told you that history isn't just something that happens to us, but something we actively create through our choices, our resistance, our persistence? I've lived that truth in ways I never anticipated when I stood before your classroom. The system that separated us remains deeply flawed, but not unchangeable. Your former teacher has learned that lesson through struggle and sacrifice, and I share it now, in hopes that you will carry it forward in your own lives. Justice isn't an abstraction or a distant ideal. It's built daily through the accumulated weight of dignified resistance to whatever seeks to diminish our humanity. I remain your teacher, and you remain my hope for the world we're collectively creating. He signed it simply. Malik, Teach Ramsey, Lockridge Federal Penitentiary. Later that afternoon, a remarkable scene unfolded. With permission from Interim Warden Daniels, part of the new administration's emphasis on community restoration, Malik's letter was read aloud over the facility's PA system, his voice reaching every cell, every common area, every workshop, and classroom within Lockridge's walls. As his words filled the spaces where silence had once been their only weapon, inmates across the facility stopped their activities to listen. In kitchens and laundry rooms, in cells and day rooms, men stood in respectful attention as Malik's message bridged the divide between their isolated world and the communities they had left behind. When the reading concluded, no applause followed. Only the same powerful silence that had become their signature form of acknowledgement, a silence no longer born of fear or suppression, but of collective recognition, of respect, of commitment to continuing what they had begun. In his cell that evening, Malik sat on the edge of his bunk, the parole letter on the small desk before him. His formal response, declining the offer with gratitude but requesting reconsideration in 1 year's time, had been submitted that morning. The decision brought neither regret nor resignation, but rather a calm certainty that his work had entered a new phase. No longer just resistance against injustice, but construction of something better in the space created by that resistance. Outside his window, lights illuminated Lockridge's perimeter, razor wire glistening in their harsh glow. The physical constraints remained unchanged. The sentences continued. The separation from loved ones and community still extracted its daily toll. Yet something fundamental had shifted within those unchanging parameters. A demonstration that human dignity, once fully claimed, could not be fully suppressed, not by walls or policies, not by systemic racism or institutional violence. As lights out approached, Malik opened his worn copy of Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited, finding the passage that had sustained him through his darkest moments in the SHU. There is something in every one of you that waits, listens, for the sound of the genuine in yourself. It is the only true guide you will ever have, and if you cannot hear it, you will all of your life spend your days on the ends of strings that somebody else pulls. The strings that had once controlled Lockridge had been cut, not completely, not irreversibly, but significantly. The system would adapt, would attempt to reassert control in new forms. Power never surrendered without continuous pressure, but the men inside these walls had discovered something no policy could revoke: their genuine voices, their collective strength, their undiminished humanity. And in that discovery lay the seeds of transformation extending far beyond Malik himself, beyond Lockridge, beyond even the prison system that had sought to define and confine them. The long game continued, not a sprint toward freedom, but a marathon toward justice, one dignified step at a time. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.